Good morning, folks. Hope you're hanging in there. We made it through the quarter, almost. Don't think it was as terrible as we anticipated, but oh my gosh, what challenges we've had. Well, we're almost through. Uh, anyway, hope you're, as I said, I hope you're hanging in there. Hope some of the changes we made to the final will help people. We'll talk about the final in just a second, but I just wanted to say a couple of things that, again, can help you a little bit dealing with all the stress that's going on with regard to the class. First of all, there's no shame in taking an incomplete. Anyone who wants an incomplete, all you have to do is, well, I guess I would prefer if you contact me just so I know for sure everything's okay. But if I see that you don't take the final for whatever reason, and you don't have a chance to contact me, I will give you an incomplete. In which case, I will be happy to help you take the test again over the summer. So functionally, that is equivalent to kind of delaying the test until a time that you're comfortable taking it. And yes, you should check in. It's just an elective course, so I don't think it's going to bear on your major very much or anything like that. But you should maybe check into that. But more importantly, you should check into the situation with your financial aid. As far as I've been told, but I'm not sure of this, but as far as I've been told, for those of you that are expecting financial aid to kick in again in the fall, as long as you finish the test sometime this summer, and the earlier the better, probably, as long as you feel up to it, you'll be okay. But please do check into that. Assuming that's fine, for many of you, it might make the most sense. And we can talk between now and the time you want to take the test. I can help you study if you'd like. I understand that this might not be the best time. For those of you that can take the test, you have between Tuesday and Sunday, and hopefully that will allow you to spread out your studying for other courses and have some extra time for studying for this course. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the test. I should tell you this, it's going to be very straightforward, really no surprises. Let me go ahead and get everything set up here. Okay. It's going to cover all the lecture material, and I am going to have to double lecture today. Hope you got the email from yesterday. No problem if you can't make that double lecture. Two things. First of all, of course, it's going to be, the second half is going to be recorded, so it's no problem if you want to watch it later. And then the other thing is that I won't be teaching anything. In fact, I don't think I've taught anything pretty much the entire quarter that hasn't been covered in the book. And so there's no material that will just be presented, certainly not in this, the second lecture today. I think pretty much at all that's not covered in the book. I do have new material I often present, but I've pulled all that out for this quarter given the circumstances. You can read the book, and if you feel comfortable with that information, that's great. If you want to have another interpretation of that information from me doing it live and from seeing me go through the slides, you'll have access to that on the recording. All discussion section material will be tested. You know something? Okay, no, it's fine. Yeah, so that includes touch and illusions, the Helen Keller video, facial attractiveness, and multisensory attractiveness and synesthesia, which was presented in most of the discussions Monday. And I was informed by one of the TAs that they actually ended up discussing current event issues and important issues about race, Black Lives Matter, and that sort of stuff, which I understand there was a need to discuss that. But we are going to have you go ahead and look at one of the discussion section recordings that was made by one of the other TAs. And hopefully your TA, Trevor, told you to do that. I will remind him to send something out that, there's not a lot of new information, but, everyone else did learn that information. So if you were in Trevor's section, it's important that you look at the video that was recorded by one of our other TAs that did go through the information on Monday. All the book material through chapter 6, there is not a lot on the test. I'm taking most of the questions out on the exam that are just taken from the book and were not covered. I'll see what I can do about doing all the questions of those, but I want to make sure I have enough questions for you folks to have a sufficient test to to have a lot of chances to show what you know. So I want to make sure there's at least 60 questions. But largely, if you're following the lectures okay, if you're following the slides okay, you should be absolutely fine for the exam. I should say this: there've been a couple of requests for like a review sheet or something like that. And I talked to the TAs, and we all agreed that the best thing to do for a review sheet is just to go through the slides. Take the slide terminology, and if you want to write it on a separate sheet, that's fine. But everything pretty much that is discussed on the slides in one form or another will be asked on the test. So there really isn't, if we were to make up a review sheet, we would just pretty much translate what's on the slides into some sort of document, and that probably isn't going to serve anybody too much. So I suggest that that's the way you think of the slides, as review sheets. Again, most of what will be on the test will come from the lectures and therefore the slides. And there will be a few questions from discussion section, of course, and maybe one or two from the book, but mostly from the slides. So that's how you can construct your own review sheet. It is open book. You have to take it alone, of course. But I do, I've talked to a lot of professors in our department about this open book thing that all of us pretty much are doing this quarter for what's going on. And we've realized there's a tendency for folks not to study if they hear it's an open book test. And you can't do that. You still have to do some studying. And the reason is because in a 60-question test for an 80-minute period, you're not going to have a chance to look up every question by any means. You're going to be able to have look up a few, certainly, and go through have your slides there and quickly jump around. Maybe after you go through the test once trying to answer, then you can kind of check your answers, but you can't come in cold. You have to definitely, do some refreshing of the slides, look maybe back on some of the lectures. All that being said, the test is going to be straightforward. It'll be easy, probably easier than the midterm. We're going to grade things very easily like we did in the midterm. I mean, the curve was a curve I've never ever given before in any year of my years teaching because of the situation. I don't want you to be stressed about failing the course. Most of you, if you do some, just going through the notes and going through the lectures, you should do well enough to not fail the course. I just want to make sure that there is some learning going on. I want to make sure that there is some, that you're getting something out of the course. Okay, a review session has been scheduled, and so it would be a good idea for you, if you're going to be using the review session live, that you go through your notes. The live session will be held Monday at 3 o'clock. Jeff and Trevor, our TAs, will be holding it. I assume they're going to be sending you a Zoom link. I will remind them if they haven't done that yet. And the session will be recorded, so if you don't have a chance to be present at the synchronous session, that would be fine. Just watch it later. I think they're also requesting questions beforehand, which I thought was a good idea. If you can't make the review session at 3, and we realize some people can't because they already have other finals scheduled. If you can't make that review session, but you want some questions answered during the review session, feel free to email Trevor or Jeff before the review session, and they will address all emailed questions during the review session. I will remind them to send out this information to you if they haven't already. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, looks like we're good. Let me take a minute now and answer questions you might have about the exam. Looks like there's a couple. Aida says, thank you for extending the exam. No problem. It really isn't too difficult for us. We just want to make sure that we are able to get the grades, sign the curve before the grades are due, which would be Tuesday. Other questions people have on the exam? No. Yeah, is that it? Are you guys hearing me okay? Just want to make sure everybody's on. Yeah, just kind of Everyone's kind of in a daze. I can completely understand that. When will the grade curve happen? The grade, we take all the grades in from the midterm and the final. We look to see what the average is, how people did, what the variance is, and then after that we assign a final letter grade. And if you look back to see what the grade range was for the midterm, then you'll have some idea of what, if you do the same, you'll have some idea of what you would do. Again, we do assign pluses and minuses. The curve is immense. I mean, it really is. I've never assigned a curve like this before. Understanding what you guys are going through. So hopefully it will be okay. What chapter in the book do we start reading at? I think the first chapter for the final was chapter 6. I'm pretty sure that's what it said on the slide. Is it after next week? Aida asks, when do I, yeah, your grades will be posted by Tuesday, a week from Tuesday. They have to be turned in by that day. So certainly by, like the very latest, I believe, is 5 on Tuesday. So your grades should be posted on iLearn. Your letter grade will be posted on iLearn by 5 o'clock on Tuesday. Probably earlier. That would be my guess on Tuesday. Okay. Other questions about the final exam or grading or anything like that? Oh, Nicholas asked, has the curve already been applied to the midterm score? No. Again, we don't assign a letter grade to the midterm. What we do is we take your 2 scores and again, look at the average of the class, and then at that point assign a letter grade based on your 2 scores. So when I sent out that rough grade range or posted that rough grade range in iLearn, it was just a way to you have a general sense of how you did, relative to how the grades are going to be dispersed. But again, there's nothing fixed about that. Depending on how people do worse or better on the final, that's going to probably shift around a little bit. But, again, I think it's so straightforward. I don't want you to stress. I do want you to learn, but I don't want you to be too worried about passing the course. Great. Until everyone takes it. Oh, no. Okay. Liana asks a very good question. I see what you're saying. I understand why you're getting this question out. So she wants to know if we have to wait till everybody takes the exam, so the people that are taking incompletes as well, before we assign letter grades. No, we can't do that. We have to assign letter grades based on the students who have finished the class as of Tuesday. So that's not only when I have to send in the letter grades, it's also when I have to send in the information about who's taking it incomplete. So yes, at that point, the letter grades will be assigned. And I think my sense is, from just talking to some individuals in the class, that many of you will be taking the final during finals week, just to get it over with and not have to worry about it. And you feel like the stress is manageable now that we've extended the time you can take it. So I think we're going to have a good sense of what the class average is going to be, even though I do understand and respect that some of the class won't be taking the final until after the quarter's over. Gotcha. Good. Okay. Good. Then we have lots to talk about. Again, it's going to have to be a double class. I'm sorry it has to work like this. I've been taking a lot of time talking with you guys. We've been spending a lot of time with our breaks and going through questions that we know are going to help you for the exam. In fact, let's admit that almost a third, if not even maybe a little bit more, of the questions on the exam you will have seen and have discussed. And so that should help you immensely. So let's go ahead then and now go back to the material. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to change my background so it's not so serious. And what do we got? Let's make it happy. Here, you'll like this. You'll like this. Hold on. There we go. There, some kitties wrestling. There, nice and fuzzy kitties wrestling. My doggy, I tried to get my dog in here, but he's not in the mood he doesn't want to deal with the paparazzi. Because he just got a haircut. And we got haircuts on the same day, actually. Remember the very first day of class? I came in with a new haircut. My wife did it. Well, this time my son did it, my older son. a high school graduate, and I think he did a better job. So if it doesn't work out for him at the University of Wisconsin, I think he's got a future in shaving bald guys' heads. Anyway, okay, let's go ahead and go back to the information. So we are talking about, I think, one of the most interesting things in the course, which is on, imitation. And I think this is a really interesting literature. And as I said, this is something that we do actually study in my lab to some degree. You know, I mean, I think we all have a sense that we do these sort of imitative actions when we're interacting with people, body language sometimes, and again, imitating accent. But what I'd like you to learn from all this is two major things. Well, three major things, I would say. One, that we're doing it all the time, and we're doing it mostly unconsciously. Okay, it's subtle, but we're doing it all the time. Secondly, it does seem to have a function to facilitate our social interactions, and we saw some of that last class. That you know, it seems to when somebody imitates us in this kind of subtle, delayed way, it makes us tend to like them better, and you know, think of the conversation as more productive, more cordial. And if they're trying to sell something, or if they want us to sample a product, it will actually generalize to the product, and we'll like the product better. And then we talked about the fact that it also makes us a better person to some degree. It actually elevates our altruism being imitated. So if we are imitated in an experiment, we'll then help other people, say, pick up their pencils or maybe contribute to some sort of charity. Again, these aren't huge effects, but they're fascinating. You know, you know, the effects probably aren't all that long lasting either, but the idea that this kind of facilitation of our social interactions through imitation actually makes you, you know, kind of want to help other people, you know, that could have some pretty, you know, important ramifications for things. And then we started talking about not only is it acting kind of, this imitation acting at a social level, it's acting at a more basic perceptual level. That's how my lab kind of got interested in this sort of thing too. And we talked a little bit about this in terms of how motor training can kind of fine-tune our perceptual skill when we're looking at a sport or watching somebody play an instrument. We're able to see more by virtue of the imitation we actually did when we were learning the skill. And then we talked about a couple of one experiment, I suppose, that involved kind of some very careful manipulation of these things. And if you learn this kind of arm dance thing while you're watching the experimenter do it, so you're doing this imitation, then what it does is it allows us to better perceive another action that involves that arm dance. And in this case, it was these what we call point light walkers, and this video is not working, but point light walkers, some of which have that weird arm coordination. And it allows us to see basically what we just learned through imitation more successfully. So it kind of, you know, it kind of improves, but it improves it in a very specific way, which is really interesting. And then we, I think, ended on this idea that we talked about covert imitation, right? The fact that our faces, I think, probably are the most intuitive example for us. Our faces are imitating faces when we see somebody making facial expressions. And it's covert. What that just means in this case is that it's something that is very subtle. It's not necessarily observable by the naked eye. To measure it, you might have to, you know, put little sensors on the mouth. But that imitation actually might play a role in perception. Okay, so we talked about the fact that it probably, you know, smiling back and forth, you know, broadly and noticeably probably does social, you know, things. That makes perfect sense. It's nice to smile at people. I mean, I think it's hard to do it when you have a mask on, but I to the degree that you can do it, you know, maybe with your eyes or something like that, I think it helps people feel better going through difficult times. Smiling does help emotionally, socially, but it also helps perceptually when we unconsciously imitate a smile. And one of the most interesting examples of that through facial expressions come through this experiment with Botox. But before I get into that, I thought I'd talk a tiny bit about how these experiments were done before Botox. Basically, there's ways of putting somebody into a kind of unconscious expression by using different kind of forms of distraction. So you can ask somebody to hold, I guess I'll do it with this, a pen in their teeth versus their lips, and then tell them, there's some reason they're doing that. Often the kind of cover story is that, we're wondering if pens can be held this way for, if somebody loses the ability to move their arms or something like that. It's a cover story. What it's really doing is it's putting people into facial expressions of which they're not aware. So when you ask somebody to hold a pen in their teeth, they're smiling. When you ask somebody to hold a pen in their lips, they're frowning, again, without being aware of that in most cases, right? They think it's another reason they're doing that. But what you find is when you do that type of thing, when you constrain somebody to one expression versus the other, it affects then how they perceive other people's facial expressions. Very subtly, but systematically. Okay? It makes it easier for them to see somebody smiling if, in fact, their own face is forced into a smile. It makes it easier for them to see that somebody is frowning if, in fact, their face is forced into a frown, which is really interesting. It suggests that the motor imitation that we're doing when we look at a face affects how we perceive other people's faces. It's very surprising. And then Botox. This is interesting. And when I first heard about this, I thought, well, that it made big news because of the Botox, kind of craze that was occurring. I think people still are very fond of Botox here in Los Angeles. I have certainly a few friends that have been using it for years, and they think it makes their face look younger. Okay, I guess it gets rid of lines around the eyes and around the mouth. You might know some people that use Botox to make their face look smoother. A study came out probably about 5 years ago or so. Didn't make the book. Okay, so here's one study that didn't make the book, but I promise you'll remember it. People who had Botox injections in order to make their faces look younger, and might know what Botox does. It temporarily kind of paralyzes, or I don't know if it paralyzes the right word, but it makes it very difficult for the muscles to move in the same way they normally would during facial expressions. So basically, when a person gets Botox, it's like their own facial expressions being a little constrained. And maybe you've seen people who've overdone it with Botox, and it's their faces look kind of odd. But most people who have Botox don't really notice. My friends who use it I don't notice. But it's enough to affect the muscles, the expressing muscles of their face. And what this research showed was, in fact, people who have Botox are a little bit inhibited in their ability to recognize other people's facial expressions. It's a very small effect, but it's systematic. So when I read this study, I was just happening to go out. My wife and I were going out with another couple, and we knew that this woman, she likes Botox. Okay, that's fine. I'm not judging. But I read this study, and I said, okay. And I told her about it, and I said, okay, let's see how you are at reading my facial expressions. This is how I feel about you using Botox. No, I didn't do that. But it was a joke, and she had no problem. When I was smiling, to say you're smiling. When I was frowning, she said you're judging me. Stop it. All that sort of stuff. That's not what we're talking about. That was a joke that I was just trying to kind of talk to her about the whole effect. The way it works in the laboratory is there's a set of faces that go from happy to sad, and you probably know that you can use Photoshop or other sorts of computer applications to set up a continuum of faces, like to kind of interpolate between the faces from happy to sad. So you have faces in the middle that are in between happy and sad, right? You could imagine having a row of faces like that. It's the same person's face, you know, going from, say, happy to sad. But in the middle, it's somewhere in between happy and sad. Most of us would, so that, I should say this just to make sure it's not clear. The differences between each of these faces in the happy to sad row, okay, are pretty slight. Okay, so in the middle, you've got a kind of neutral face, and on this side, you've got a neutral face that might be a little bit sadder, and on the other side, you might have a neutral face that might be a little bit happier. But these are subtle differences. Most of us would be able to say whether this face and this face is the same or different. It'd be hard. We'd have to look at it a while. Maybe we'd feel like we were guessing because they'd be very close. But if you have Botox, you have more trouble making that distinction. You wouldn't always be right. You'd say, it's very hard for me to do it. And again, there's subtle effects. My friend can tell that's a sad face and that's a happy face when they're at the end of this row here. But she would have trouble saying whether these two faces were the same or different because they're more subtle, the differences. And again, nothing has she's not, her overall vision hasn't changed, right? It's not like all of a sudden she has to wear glasses because she's using Botox. What's changed is her imitative ability to recognize expressions because she can't use her own expressions. So her imitation would normally, for most of us that don't use Botox, our imitation allows us to see expressions more easily. If, in fact, those imitations are inhibited, either by a pen in the mouth or by Botox injection directly into the muscles, the ability to recognize subtle differences between expressions is more difficult, which is really interesting because it suggests that we use our imitation to be better perceivers. This is what that means that they're on the top. There's lots of other experiments that have shown that. I think that's one of the ones that you'll remember the rest of your life. So if you meet, if you have a friend, if you have a family member who really says Botox, has changed my life, it makes me feel younger, all these things, say that's wonderful, but you should know that you can go through my lecture if you want. It's going to be something you'll probably remember for a long, long time. Let me just talk about a few other experiments that, aren't as kind of flashy, but are interesting. These images that you can see here on the bottom are just somebody, I don't know if it's a dancer or an acrobat or something, but it doesn't make a difference. What they're doing is they're just kind of posing in different positions. And the job of the subject in the experiment would be to say, are in fact these the same positions that you're seeing from the side and you're seeing from the front? And the images would be better and clearer, and you'd have to look at each of the limbs, the direction of the foot, the direction of the right hand, the direction of the left hand, and make this comparison back and forth. And they don't have that much time to do it. I think it's a total of maybe 3 seconds. So sometimes they'll get it right and sometimes they'll get it wrong. But what's interesting is their ability to make that match, to say whether it's the same position or different position, the same posture or different posture, will depend on what their own body is doing as they're making those judgments. So here I am, a subject looking at these images, and I'm sitting down, and if I'm not doing anything, I'm pretty good. Okay, I can say whether these are the same or different. And these kind of look like the same. They're not great image quality, but I would say these are the same. In other cases, they're going to be subtly different. However, here's the cool thing. If while I am making these judgments, I've been told to move my arm back and forth like this, and I don't even really see my arm moving back and forth, okay? Then what happens is I then become a little bit worse at making those matches, saying they're better, they're the same or different. But what I'm affected at is determining whether the hand or arm positions are the same or different. Okay, so as I myself am moving my limbs, the limb I'm moving affects my ability to subtly see whether an arm is in the same position across these two slides. Maybe in another condition, another group of subjects comes in, and they are also doing the exact same task. They're matching these two images, but they're not moving their arm. They're moving their leg back and forth, and you can't see it, but I'm swinging my leg back and forth right now. You wouldn't be surprised to find out that, in fact, the ability to make these matches is again suppressed, but not in terms of whether the arms match across the images, but in terms of whether the legs match across the images. So it seems that when we occupy our limbs, it affects the way we see other people's limbs to some degree. And it probably has something to do with this kind of subtle imitation that might occur as we're seeing another person's postures. It might be very much like the face imitation sort of experiments, the blinded by Botox experiments, but in this case, it's kind of a more direct manipulation of what the arms and legs are doing. So what we're saying here is that your motor system influences how you perceive, but it does so in a very interesting way. It does so in a way that is specific to the body, that is specific to what is being done with the body, and whether that action allows the brain to do this imitation, right? So if I am moving my arm, I become a little worse at perceiving other people's arm motions. If I'm moving my leg, I become a little worse at perceiving other people's leg motions. And the idea here is, by doing those motions, I'm not able to kind of do the subtle imitation that now is going on deep inside the body, inside the brain, that typically allows us to be more accurate at distinguishing somebody else's body motions. Okay? All right, let's go on to the next slide. And let me, hold on just a second. I need to pin here. How do I do that? Okay. Pin video. I saw a couple of times that other people's images came up because they were coughing or something like that. And that's fine, but just want to make sure that everyone on the movie can see the kitties. Okay. So it's going to get a little technical now, but that's okay, because you're really smart. As you've gone through the course, you've gotten smarter and smarter now. The idea is we use our motor system to perceive. And one of the ways that that has been tested is by a technology that I believe we talked about before, just very briefly, but we'll use a lot now on this slide. It's this technology called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Remember, we did talk about this a little bit. We talked about it in the context of touch, I believe. And what that does, that transcranial magnetic stimulation, I know it sounds fancy, it's TMS, transcranial. That just means across the, across the skull, magnetic stimulation. So basically, these little mouse ear things are imparting a strong magnetic pulse to a part of the brain across the skull. That's all it means, It's just going to put these little this thing. I've been in these experiments before, so they're a little weird, but they're not dangerous. But this thing kind of swings around your head, and they place it outside parts of your head, where different regions of the brain are located, and then you hear this thing, and it feels a little weird, but it doesn't last for very long. What it is essentially doing is temporarily creating it's going to break that part of the brain. What that means? It's creating a temporary lesion. It's going to break that part of the brain for just a second. And so what we're going to do now in all of these experiments is swing this thing. Actually, this picture isn't completely representative of what I'll be talking about, because what we're going to do is swing the little mouse ears around. So it's affecting the motor strip part of our brain, which is on the side. So imagine we swing it around. So we're going to be just affecting the motor areas of the brain. And we can kind of confirm that by asking people, to move part of their body, and then, kind of turning on this device and see if it affects their motion, and it will a little bit, So I think it goes across the brain goes across the body. So if you swung the mouse ears here, turned it on over my motor strip, and I was asked to move my fingers, I would have a little trouble moving them in a coordinated way. And they say, okay, perfect. Now we know what we're doing is we are temporarily, for a very short time, just busting the motor strip, just breaking the motor part of the brain for this purpose, okay? And what it does is not only affect our motions, it affects our perception of other people's motions. And so depending on, the nice thing about this device also is you can, kind of guide it towards, it's very specific to the part of the motor brain it affects. So you can kind of move it around up and down. So it affects just the part of the motor brain that moves the face muscles, right? I can't remember where that is. Remember we saw that kind of weird map that was on here when we were talking about plasticity, right? So maybe, I don't know, say it's right here, just making this up. If underneath the brain right there, if you were to, kind of open up this little part of my skull, you'd see the face area, the part that controls the muscles for the face. And if you then kind of break that little part using this transcranial magnetic stimulation, you would in fact inhibit that subject's ability not to just move their own face, but to perceive other people's emotion. So what you're doing is you're breaking the part of the brain that controls muscles of a person. And it not only affects their muscles, it affects their perception of how other faces are using their muscles. It affects how we perceive. And there's been other experiments where people are asked to judge how much weight a person is lifting in a video, right? Whether it's a lot of weight or a little weight. And they get pretty good at this, and especially if they're asked to just kind of say, seeing two videos and saying, is this one heavier or lighter than the one you just saw? They're good at that. It's not surprising. They're good at that. Unless, in fact, this little TMS device is placed right over the part of their motor brain that controls the arm. And if that occurs, they do have a little trouble controlling their own arm. But more interestingly, for this discussion, they have trouble perceiving the kind of nuances of other people's arms, so they can no longer tell very easily whether this person is lifting a heavy weight or a light weight. So again, what it suggests is that affecting the motor parts of our brain, the parts that control our own movement, also affect how we see other people's motions. And there's other examples of this too. You can show this on hand and arm actions. And by the way, I should say all of this disruption doesn't ever affect somebody's ability to say, oh, that's a hand or that's an arm. It's the actions of the arm and hand, not the recognition of the body part itself, but the actions of those body parts that are inhibited when our own motor brain is affected like this. Okay, which is really interesting because, forever, I mean, maybe you learned in your biology courses in high school even that we have a motor part of the brain and a perception part of the brain, and we have motor neurons that go out to the muscles, and then we have sensory neurons that come back from the skin and the eyes and the ears, and they're really two different systems. But now we're seeing there's this kind of really interesting connection, so that if our motor system is affected, our perception system is affected. We'll talk a little bit more about the kind of the importance of that in just a second. But a couple of other things I just wanted to mention very quickly on this slide about covert imitation. And so, we talked about covert imitation being an example where we are actually smiling kind of reflexively when we see somebody else's smile. Does that happen? Do our muscles actually move when we're watching somebody pitch or watching somebody play guitar? It does. It can happen, but it doesn't happen like faces. So this kind of reflexive sort of reactions we have with faces has been observed, of course, many, many times with faces. But, if you're watching somebody, moving their arm, you won't necessarily see muscle activity in the arm. It seems to really be limited to faces. But there is a way to show that the brain is kind of doing a little bit of an imitation of the body as we're watching that. And I'm not going to get too much into the technical details, but there's another way of using transcranial magnetic stimulation. And I know this is going to go beyond a little bit the technical, interests of many of you, but some of you will, go become psychology majors and be interested in this type of thing, perhaps. You can use transcranial magnetic stimulation to break a part of the brain, depending on how much of the stimulation is created. You have a large pulse, and all of a sudden you're kind of breaking that. So you're kind of suspending that part of the brain for just a second. But there's another thing you can do with that part of the brain, where you actually prime it and make it potentially more excited. And it has to do with the type of pulse you use. A weak, short pulse actually, to the motor cortex, makes the motor cortex a little bit more sensitive. It actually heightens its ability to do things. And that's going to, just as an aside, that has some implications, interesting implications for rehabilitation and for even manipulation of mood and things like that. Maybe you've heard of TMS helping patients that are depressed. It's this type of TMS machine that, or I should say, use. This type of use of the TMS that can help individuals with depression potentially. But what that does in the context of our discussion is it kind of primes the motor area to actually be a little bit more excited. It doesn't break it, it does just the opposite because we're using a different type of pulse in the TMS machine. It primes our muscles. And when you do that, then you start seeing covert imitation. So here I am, Rosenblum watching somebody throw a football, okay? And nothing will happen right off the bat in my arm muscles like they would for my face muscles when I was watching somebody express something. But now what they're going to do is they're going to take that TMS and not break that brain area, but prime the brain area, just kind of like say, get excited, get excited, get excited. And when it's done like that, the entire area is kind of excited like that. Then you start seeing these kind of imitations occurring in the muscles themselves. And they will be specific to the actions I'm seeing. So if now I'm watching somebody throw a football and my overall, motor system is being primed with TMS, you will see kind of imitative muscle activity in this arm. So you can, in fact, prime it like this. And it does happen that watching a hand or arm will then induce activity in my hand and arm muscles. So it is like the face sort of reactions that we discussed before. Face imitations don't need this priming, but just with a little priming with TMS, you do start to see the same sort of things in arm, leg, hand muscles that you see with faces. And this is also true. It's a little bit it's going to be relevant to something we're talking about later, but it's just a little tangential to what we're talking about. When you are listening to speech, when you are listening to speech, as you're listening to me right now, okay, there is some evidence that, especially if the speech is difficult, if I, for example, do this and it's more difficult to understand my speech, okay, not terribly more difficult, you understood it probably, but when I was doing that, your speech muscles were actually becoming a little active, okay? It typically only happens when the speech is distorted in a way, or it can happen if we want to use the TMS, then you'll definitely see some muscle activity there if we're priming with TMS. But the fact that we use our own motor system to help us perceive speech that is distorted is really interesting. And the same is true of lip reading, which we'll find out in our second discussion today. Okay, I know that's technical, so let's take a little break and see if there's any questions. Take a little breather. Okay. Are we okay with these kitties? Are they too distracting? I think they look ridiculously cute to me. Yeah, they're very cute. Okay, they're too cute. Oh, Thomas says they're too cute to even concentrate. So they're so cute, they're taking away from my cuteness, so you can't concentrate on me. All right, questions. Aida asks, we talked about this transcranial magnetic stimulation when we were talking about plasticity. I do remember that. Yes, thank you. Wasn't TMS temporarily numbs the area, so neuron plasticity happens? No, what we use it for really, it's a great tool as you suggested, Aida, to understand plasticity. It helps us basically map out the brain in a really interesting way that almost goes beyond imaging the brain, like when we talked about fMRI, looking at pictures of the brain. This actually allows us to play with the brain in a way to see if now the visual cortex for a blind person is involved with touch. If we, in fact, use TMS to kind of wipe out the function of the visual brain in a blind individual, then we would know something about its involvement with touch or hearing for the blind individual. It's really, really good question. Faye asks, when you say the results of studies are subtle but are systematic, what do you mean when you say they're systematic? Yeah, so I mean that they are statistically significant. I mean that you do see differences between groups that are, say, have a TMS manipulation versus those that don't. Or the Botox. Let's go with Botox because people, I think, really understand this Botox idea. What I mean is that if you were to do the experiment of Botox and non-Botoxed people looking at these faces, you'd see that, yeah, in fact, the Botoxed individuals are worse at discriminating subtle differences in facial expression, worse than people that don't have Botox. Okay, so yeah, the statistics, you'll learn about this if you go through a psychology major. The statistics show there is a real difference between these two groups, but it's a subtle difference. Again, my friend, despite my trying to be funny at dinner that night, my friend can tell when I'm smiling and tell when I'm frowning. It's just these kind of very subtle distinctions she has trouble making. So they are subtle differences, but they're statistically significant. They are systematic in that, you test a group here that uses Botox in Los Angeles, you test a group in New York that uses Botox, and you find the same sort of differences between Botox and non-Botox groups. Okay, that's really what it means. Okay. I'm taking statistics and it is difficult. It is difficult, but I think, I don't care about you understanding statistics for this course, but no, in principle, when I say systematic, that it's something that, should be able to be shown in other groups as well. That same experiment can be conducted, in other parts of the country that with Botox versus non-Botox people. And in principle, yeah, you should see it again and again. That's a systematic result, even if it's kind of a subtle effect. Okay, does that help? Good. Other things about TMS? Anything else? I know people have a little concern. I hope I explained it fairly clearly. All right, let's do a question. Yes, let's do an imitation question. And this has to do with the imitation that infants do when they hear speech, the imitation that we discussed with infants with regard to speech sounds. Here's the question. Very young infants have been shown to imitate ah and m mouth movements when A, hearing these speech sounds, B, seeing these speech movements on a face, C, reading these letters, I guess M and ah, or D, both A and B. So let's go ahead and do this and see how you do and then talk about the answer. Good. Holy cow. So far, we're at 100%. All right, I'm going to stop it. Looks like we have, 98%. Somebody, it's okay, no problem. You did really, really well. I'm glad you realized that 2-week-old infants can't read. Although, when my kids were young, I'm going to stop the poll now. When my kids were young, there was a commercial on where people were, there was a company that said that they had a product that would teach pre-verbal infants to read. So it was the product was called My Baby Could Read. And when my kids were young, they thought it was the funniest thing that they would be able to teach a baby before it started babbling to recognize letters. It was like the silliest thing in the world. And so we came up with all these other ideas we were going to pitch, like My Baby Can Drive, that type of thing. Anyway, let's go ahead and share the results. Of course, the answer is D, both A and B. You remember that they do imitate when they hear speech sounds at a very young age, right? And they do imitate when they see speech movements. In other words, they're seeing them on the face. They're essentially lip reading. And so the correct answer is both A and B. Your babies can't read despite the commercials we used to see. All right, let me know if there's any questions on these. And okay. Good. Let's continue talking about this imitation then. And I have to let you know that this next slide is a little bit technical, but you're so smart, I'm not worried about you understanding it. And when we get through this slide, then we get to talk about magic, and I will reveal one of Rabini's tricks. Okay. So the idea here is your brain is always imitating. And what we are going to be talking about here is a very famous experiment that was done in Italy. And it's one of these experiments that supposedly has this kind of cute background story to it that I'll just share with you very quickly. It involved this, and what I'm going to be discussing here right now are what we call action planning cells. And these are cells that are going to be active when an animal is basically moving a limb with some sort of intention. Like in this case, it's going to be monkeys grabbing raisins that are on a plate in front of it. And this laboratory was studying these cells. It wanted to know kind of what the timing was between when the cells lit up and when the movements occurred. Did it happen before the movement? Did it happen kind of at the same time as the movement? But that's kind of secondary to the importance of the story. Supposedly, this is the story. There were graduate students and professors there testing the monkey. They were, the monkey was perfectly comfortable. They did recordings from the monkey's brain, but there was no damage to the monkey. Lived a happy, long life. But as the monkey was reaching for the raisins, they did in fact see these cells light up. And then they gave the monkey a little break, and they do. They knew the monkey was going to want to relax a little bit. The monkey was grabbing for the raisins and putting them in his mouth, basically, but they wanted to give him a little break. And while they were giving him a little break, I guess one of the graduate students, and you can tell graduate students, don't make a lot of money because this one was especially hungry, said, I'm very happy with this. I have a good relationship with this monkey. I don't mind eating the monkey's raisins, and I'm sure he's not going to mind either. So can you imagine how hungry you'd have to be to want to eat monkey raisins? So the grad student said, I'm hungry. I'm going to eat some of these, and put his hand into the plate and started eating the raisins. Well, the monkey didn't mind. I mean, it's not like the monkey went crazy or anything like that. But what was interesting is those same cells that were involved in controlling and initiating the monkey's movements became active when it was watching another animal, in this case, a human, performing those same actions. So it's kind of one of these really cool discoveries that occurred by mistake. Right? These same cells, these action planning cells, not only were used during initiation of movements for the monkey, but also watching somebody else grab for those raisins. Okay, and that was a really weird discovery because, so there's another example about holding a banana, same sort of thing. It seems that these cells that were part of the motor area of the brain, which we always considered just to be involved in the motor control of the animal, also was involved in seeing and responding to those exact same motions. So those cells, if they were cells involved in grabbing a raisin, they would not respond to seeing somebody walk around, or they wouldn't respond to seeing somebody, make a monkey face to the monkey. They only responded when that same action, grabbing, okay, there's a raisin, grabbing a raisin in the same way. And they mapped these out, and they found there was a lot of cells in the motor area that had this dual role. They were involved in initiating motions and controlling motions, and they were involved in detecting those motions when somebody else was performing them. And they labeled these mirror neurons. I think it's a good name, right? It was as if these neurons were involved in one's own actions and seeing somebody else's actions that were the exact same type of actions. And this is the idea of mirror neurons. Now, in humans, it's hard for us to do what we call single cell recordings. It's hard for us to look at the action of individual cells. But it is possible for us to look at using different types of imaging techniques for us to look at areas in the brain that might be analogous, might be similar to what's going on with monkeys. And so when we talk about humans, we talk about a mirror neuron system, sometimes just abbreviated as MNS, okay, mirror neuron system. Don't worry too much about memorizing, these abbreviations. They should be pretty obvious, and there could be very few on the test if there are any at all. And so these are the analogous areas in the human brain. And so we know that there are regions that are probably full of cells in the motor area that are responsive to seeing hand motions and face actions, as well as initiating those hand actions and face actions. And so we do believe that humans, like monkeys, have these cells that we long thought were just involved in making action to also respond to action. And we believe that these are the parts of the brain that are helping with perception. So working all the way up to this, we said that imitation helps us with perception. These are very likely the brain areas that do this, okay? They help with perception. And in fact, we know now that, by localizing, by determining where these specific areas of these cells are that seem to have this dual role of acting and perceiving the same motion, the same action, okay? That in fact, if you then, once you determine where that is, use your friend transcranial magnetic stimulation again, that is where you find that, yes, you do affect somebody's ability to move and, say, grab a raisin. They maybe have a little bit of problem coordinating that, okay, if you then use the TMS for that transient lesion. But they also have some problem perceiving whether somebody else is doing that. It's a subtle effect, but they might not be able to see something like this. So they might see the beginning of the movement and they'll say something, they'll be asked something like, are they on target to grab the raisin? Okay. They might have a difficult time doing that. Here it's clear they're on target to grab the raisin. Here they're missing the target. They might have a difficult time doing that as they're watching a video of somebody else trying to grab a raisin, if in fact their own motor area that controls raisin grabbing has been, temporarily lesioned by TMS. Okay. Interestingly, and maybe not surprisingly, this area is absolutely most active when somebody is asked to imitate. So, we asked now Rosenblum, the subject, to imitate Bobo the chimp as the Bobo the chimp grabs raisins. Okay, so now I'm Bobo, and now I'm Rosenblum watching Bobo, and I'm going to do the same thing. That's when you see so much activity, the greatest amount of activity in the mirror neuron system. So you get the idea, I think. All this time we've been working towards this idea of there's something in the brain that is kind of laying the groundwork for this automatic imitation that's going on, and it does seem to help social psychology, social interaction. It does seem to help perception, and now we know it could be these groups of cells that are involved in both initiating and perceiving action and are most active when we're imitating. Okay, so now we have a part of the brain that we believe is involved with all this really cool imitation stuff. Okay, just a couple of other points and then we'll do some magic, okay? Somebody asked before about yawning. And is yawning a good example of this, contagious yawning? It absolutely is. I can't remember in the book where the status of that research was, but now I think it's pretty much established that, yes, we do the same cells that are involved in initiating our own yawns are activated when we watch somebody else's yawns, and that probably provides the basis for contagious yawning. Some interesting things about this. There is a difference in how contagious yawning is depending on how familiar you are with somebody. So you're more likely to imitate a yawn, to kind of reflexively yawn if you see a parent yawn than if you see somebody that you don't know, say in a coffee shop yawn. It still happens, but it will happen more with somebody you have some familiarity with. But in either case, it is very likely an example of the mirror neuron system involved in yawning being activated by watching somebody yawning. So yes, Um, I'm not going to talk too much about this other intentions thing, but one idea here is that what this does, maybe one of the purposes it serves, is it allows us to determine other people's intentions as they're moving around, whether they're going to try to grab the same raisin as us, whether they mean us harm or something. It might kind of support our ability to anticipate what somebody else is doing, which might serve a protective purpose for us. It might serve a number of other kind of adaptive purposes for us. Don't worry too much about that. It goes beyond the class, but I thought for some of you it would be interesting. There is also speculation about this system being involved in autism. Or just the autism spectrum. And you probably, folks, a lot of you know that now we consider it a spectrum that involves Asperger's individuals as well as autistic individuals. There is some speculation that when somebody does have autism, that in fact it could be a problem with, at least to some degree. Autism is very complicated, but to some degree it could be related to their some sort of problem with their mirror neuron system. Okay, so we do know that people who have autism actually do have, they are inhibited in imitation. Okay, so they don't show the same sort of reflexive imitation in faces, facial expression, as much as other people. They don't show even as much contagious yawning. And in fact, when they are measured in terms of their activity in their brains as they're watching people doing things, okay, you don't see that kind of perceptual response in the motor areas that you see with people who are not, on the spectrum. So there is some speculation that it might be partially involved in what goes on with autism. And maybe some of you know, if you've ever worked with autistic individuals, that one of the ways that they are I guess, one of the ways that the rehabilitation works is, depending on whether they have severe or not, or less severe autism, they are often taught to kind of consciously kind of imitate somebody else's facial expression. So you would say to this person, okay, when you see somebody smile, you should smile too. And let's practice that back and forth. And that does seem to help a little bit. And maybe what that's doing is kind of bypassing the problem that occurs in the mirror neuron system for those individuals. It is speculative. I think there is some controversy about how important a functioning mirror neuron system is for autism. But I thought I would mention it. And then finally, the idea of empathy. So I think we all know people, that now we're not talking about individuals who are on the spectrum, but people that have more or less, that we would say have more or less empathy, in their personalities, in their actions. And there is some evidence that there's a bit of a correlation between the amount of activity in the mirror neuron system as somebody's watching somebody else and the level of empathy a person has. So if you take a little questionnaire and give it to a group of subjects, and they're asked how empathetic they feel they are, and I think sometimes in these experiments they ask their family members, would you say this person is empathetic, that sort of thing. And then they are also measured for the amount of mirror neuron system activity when they're watching other people just perform actions. You do see this correlation between at least self-rated empathy, that sort of personality trait, and the amount of mirror neuron system activity that occurs. Okay. Again, it's a little speculative. Empathy is a very complicated personality trait. And the mirror neuron system is very complicated too. So you always have to be careful before you say, hey, the mirror neuron system is so important. It underlies what we call the autism spectrum range, and also it makes somebody more or less empathetic. I think it's much too early to say something like that, but I think that some of you would find that really interesting, so I would at least stick it in there and know that researchers are working on those issues. I see a lot of questions before we get to the magic stuff. So I am going to stop here. Yawning contagious? Yes. No, 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 no. Yeah. Well, I yawn even when people say that the world's yawn. You can imagine how many times I just yawned. Oh no. So hearing me say yawn, 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 every time I say that, Samantha, you yawn? Really? Just saying the word yawn makes you yawn? Okay, just kidding. Some of the Jackson has the same problem. Oh, I shouldn't say yawn anymore. Oh my gosh. What if I say something that, like rhymes with yawn, like lawn? Does that make you yawn? Lawn? Yeah? Okay. All right. I'm mean. Then let's talk about this. Okay, let's just go right into magic. Well, you probably want a question. I'll give you the question after the magic. Don't tell Rabini, but I am going to show you something about how Rabini did some of that trick last week. Remember, he made a ball vanish and then reappear in that magic box. We all remember that too, right? Okay, so this is how Rabini did it. You probably on thinking about it figured it out to some degree, but maybe at least initially the effect worked on you. Rabini, I have to say, is a little out of practice. But this is what Rabini did. Rabini put the ball in the left hand like this, tapped, and showed it wasn't there. Okay. Again, where's the ball? Oh, it was in my pocket. There we go. Rabini takes this, puts it in the left hand, right there, taps the hand, and it's not there. Now, you know how it's done, right? Where's the ball when I do that? Somebody tell me. Where's the ball? One more time, I'll do it. Okay, it's in the left hand, but where's the ball for real? One hand, exactly right. But to make it effective, yes, in the hand with the wand. Oh, so you're much better at observing magic than I am. It's pretty obvious. I've done it again and again, and that's one of the reasons a magician doesn't do tricks over and over again. But what I did, and it's something I want to show you, a couple of things I did to do that, is when I put the ball in the left hand, I put my finger, often I'll do this, I'll look at the left hand, I will actually change my weight a little bit to make it seem more like the ball's in the left hand. And then in fact, what I'll do is I'll use my right hand just kind of to grab the wand. It's a tool. And we typically don't think of having something in a hand while you already have when the wand's been added to it, right? And I continue to look at the left hand. And what that does is it draws your attention to the left hand and it makes the magic more effective. So my gaze, where I'm looking, is imitated by your attention. And that's the cool thing. That's why I got into this whole magic thing. I found this such a cool thing, such a cool way to learn about the imitative brain. Where I am looking, where my attention goes, is where your attention goes. After a while, certainly you can see through it. The next time you see Rabini, don't tell him this, at least play along. But as I'm doing this, okay, I am attending here, and that's where your attention goes. And in fact, I'll show you a better example of this by a better magician. Yes, there he is. Are you seeing this? Are you guys all seeing this image of this guy at a desk? Hopefully you are. I'm going to assume you are. And oh, this is a video again. It's not going to come out great, but at least it will show what I'm going to be talking about. Uh-oh. Oh my gosh, what's going on here? This is not working. Okay, hold on a second. Nobody panic. Let me share again. Sorry about this. This is so fun. I can't not show this to you. Yeah, there he is. Okay, let me make it bigger and let's watch what he's going to do here. What the heck? This isn't working? There he is. Lighting a cigarette. Hopefully you can see this. And wait, the lighter disappeared. And where did the cigarette go? Okay. So hopefully, I know it was probably jagged for all of you and all that sort of thing, but that's okay, because what I wanted to show you, now let's cancel all this. What I wanted to show you was that where he looked was part of the trick. Okay, where he looked was part of the trick. All right. After reading the book about the magic, now it makes sense. The magician makes the things disappear, cigarettes on the floor. Yeah, you could probably see through it. You're a much more sophisticated audience than the typical magic audience and these experiments, but it does work. Okay, you know, God, I can't believe this is going so slow. All right, I'm just having too much fun with you guys. One polling question very quickly so we can help you with your exam. I know this is what you guys like. Let's do another one of these. Yeah, this one's good. This is another imitation one, and I know, let's see. Yes. Actually, let me just switch this to, yeah. So being subtly imitated in a smooth, delayed manner would likely make you angry, make you like the imitator more, C, make you like the item the imitator is trying to sell a little more, or both B and C. Okay, so go ahead and you can read it now. And it shouldn't be hard for you. Another way of you getting an exam question. Okay, good. I'm going to stop it early this time. I want to make sure we finish up this lecture. So I'm stopping it. I'm sharing the results. Again, most of you got it perfectly. It doesn't make you angry. What makes you angry is when someone immediately imitates you and exaggerates it like your siblings. You should still be angry at them for doing that to you when you were little. Okay. It does make you like the imitator more. So that is true. It is one of those things that, remember, it facilitates social interaction. It kind of, people say it's a more successful interaction, and then they do say they do like the person who did the imitation of it more. And as I said, actually, earlier, even today, that if they are giving you a sample of something, if they are trying to sell you something, if you are being subtly imitated, it does make you like that thing, whether it would make you buy a car or a house or something like that. No. But it would make you say, yes, I did like that thing a little bit more. And you'll be unconscious. So the correct answer is B and C. Let me just say something about B and C answers. You might be picking up a pattern here. Whenever Rosenblum asks a question where there's multiple answers correct, always go for that one. Yeah, I do that a lot, sorry. But sometimes that will be a choice and it won't be the right answer. So just keep your eye on that. Okay, great. Let's go right back into the lecture now, just to finish this up. Oh, where's the lecture? Shoot. Hold on just a second. Sorry. Hold on a second. Okay. Good. All right, let me see if I can finish this up just very quickly. How much time we got? This is exactly what's in the book, and we've already talked about it just now. But basically what we're talking about here is a different type of imitation, but it's the same general principles apply. And that is, we will look where the magician's looking. We will look where somebody's eye gaze is looking. And remember, you might have done this when you were a kid. We didn't have the internet, so this is what we would do when we were kids. A few friends would kind of get together and look just like to this blank spot in the sky just to see how many other people would look at it, right? To kind of trick them. Let's see if we can get everyone to look at the sky. So a few of my friends we'd all look in the same spot, and then people would come up and kind of look too. That's kind of a very kind of silly example, but this idea of eye gaze is something that does happen. And what this is showing right here, I'm not going to go through the details of this, but what this is showing, oh shoot, did not mean to do that. Can I go back to this? Yeah. What this is showing right here is if you track somebody's actual eyes, they will, in fact, track the magician's eyes, okay, for the most part. So when that magician was looking at his hands, so that then allowed him to do something else, right? In fact, I did do something else when I did drop the ball, or Rubini dropped the ball on Tuesday when I was looking at this hand. You might not have noticed that. But it allows the magician to control the audience's attention. And if you then track the audience's eyes, you will see that they will follow the magician's eyes to a large degree. And that's what this is showing here. interestingly, this kind of imitation happens with a bit of a lag. So when I look here at this hand, you then look here, or at least your attention goes there with about a half-second lag. And magicians know this. They don't count to, a half second or anything like this, but they know to wait a second before they do something else sneaky, okay, which is really interesting. It's kind of an intuition for them. And what it's tapping into is your imitative tendency, which is really cool. Let me talk about one other aspect of this. And this is what we're talking about here is gaze misdirection. In other words, magicians use gaze in order to manipulate the audience's attention. And what I'm going to do is show you two examples of the same trick, one of which will work and one of which won't. Here's the same magician who's also a researcher, I know. Here we go. Throwing a ball up. Ta-da! Okay, so it's not a great trick. But, and probably it wasn't very smooth, and I apologize for that. But you might have noticed that the ball seemed to disappear the last time he threw it up. And let's look at this one now, which is another example of it. And I think you're going to find this works less well. Yeah. And what he's doing is, clearly, on the first example, he's following the trajectory, with his eyes, he's following the trajectory of where the ball should go. And when he does that, people, if they're asked how the trick is done, they'll say, oh, somebody must be on the top catching it, or something like that, which isn't true. It's clearly just in his hand. It's just kept in his hand. Okay, hopefully you're able to see that. So his gaze, where he's looking, will kind of manipulate the audience's interpretation. Very, very important thing. And we know this through tracking, like, subjects' eyes when they're acting like the audience in these experiments, basically. Okay. Now, as it turns out, in this particular experiment, when you track the eyes, they actually do follow the ball to a large degree. And in fact, they aren't as fooled as you would think. So I said that we do imitate gaze with our own gaze. Yes, to some degree, but it always isn't complete. And in this particular example, your eyes will follow the ball. And in fact, that's what this is showing down here. This is the first throw. This is the second throw. And these little dots indicate where, in fact, your eyes are looking. And then this is the third throw. And as you can see, the eyes don't go up that much. But it's still affected by the magician's gaze. And regardless, even if when you watch the audience's eyes, if they don't do exactly what the magician's eyes are doing, that's okay. Because what does happen is the attention of the audience follows the magician's gaze. So when I looked at my hand as the magician, when I wanted you to think the ball was in there, your eyes might not have gone directly to where my eyes were looking. But your attention, where your brain was attending to, did go there. So in these cases, it's as if your eyes are not fooled, but your awareness, your attention is fooled. And magicians know this. They know, yeah, I don't care if everyone's actually physically looking where I want them to look, because I know that even if their eyes are looking right at me, they have enough of a view of what's going on that their attention is going there. And it's something they know, and it's something they manipulate. Okay, it's just another example of a imitation I thought you would find interesting, especially given Rabini's appearance in class. This ends this lecture. We're going to go to the next lecture now. And what I'm going to do is take a little bit of a 5-minute break just so I can use the restroom, and comb all my luxurious hair. And then we'll come back and start our second lecture, which will be on speech perception. I know many of you aren't going to be here live. That's okay. It will be recorded. Thanks. If I don't see you, if I don't talk to you, good luck with everything that's going on. Let's hope that next time, this year, next time, if we see each other, we'll say, God, that was a tough time, but we got through it. Life is back to normal. Okay. See many of you in a few minutes, about 5 minutes. Thanks. Okay, we're back. I just realized that this moment of silence is coming up for George Floyd, and all the UCs are observing it. So in just a few minutes, I think we'll take just a 30 seconds or so and take a little break. But then we can continue. What we're going to be talking about is a multisensory speech to finish up our discussion. And I think that will just take about an hour and 20 minutes. So for those of you, there's about 40 of you, that's okay. And then hopefully the rest of you will have a chance to look at it, through the videotape. That's how you're seeing me now. Let me just see if there's any quick questions that came up from the last discussion. My brother would trick us by looking at a different direction and say, look, they're fighting, while fiddling with his fingers. And I noticed I looked back and didn't see anyone. Then he would laugh and say, look at my fingers. Or he would look, there's a puppy while eating, and then would steal my dessert. Yeah, well, that's what siblings are for. Right. But after a while, you kind of don't fall for it. At least you don't think you fall for it. But in fact, you still do. Your attention does go the way somebody else's attention goes, and it clearly serves a adaptive purpose for us to do so. So yeah. And Aida asks, will I be posting more polls? Yeah, we'll do some more polls during this second section. So let's just take a couple of seconds here before, if you guys want to ask more questions, you can. And then in about a minute, we're going to just do a moment of silence for the folks that have lost their lives in the police brutality and murdering. Okay, I think what I'm going to do is just personally, you guys do whatever you feel is right for yourselves. I'm going to, I think, take a knee for about a minute to honor the memory. And I believe there are some memorial services actually starting at this time, which is why this time was selected. Okay. Okay. Just wanted to say, I know this has been such a difficult time for all of us, but for those of us that have been around a while and have participated in these sort of protests before, I have to say there's something different about what's going on right now with these protests, in terms of both the range of people that are involved with them, and in many cases, the response by the government officials and the police forces themselves also kind of taking a knee in solidarity to the protesters. Let's just hope this continues. There's so much more work to do, but I think despite how terrible things seem now, there are signs of encouragement. So just keep attentive, keep aware, and please vote in November. Okay, that's all. Let's go back and continue discussing the material then. Are there any questions on the material from before? Should I go back to my kitty cats? What do you think? I'll leave it up to you folks. You like the kitty cats, or should I use another one? Kitty cats, you got it, Thomas. There we go. All right. I could watch kitty cats all day. All right. So let's go to this new discussion. And of course, in some ways, I like to save the best for last. This is the research that a lot of what we test in my laboratory has to do with speech perception and multisensory speech perception. So we will be talking about my research, but we're going to be talking about a lot of other people's research too. But this is one of my favorite topics to talk about because I've spent 35 years studying this sort of thing. And the way I like to start talking about this, and the way it's discussed in the book, is by introducing you to Sue Thomas. And then you can see her right there. She's on the left in that top image. And Sue, if you've read ahead, you might know this, was a professional lip reader for the FBI. It's an interesting story you should look at in the book, but she wasn't originally hired for that purpose. She was hired for another purpose. But when they realized that she was such a good lip reader, they asked her to do look at surveillance videos and to do some live lip reading to determine what people were saying that couldn't be heard because of, most surveillance videos don't have audio on them. The cameras that are, in public places, for example, very often don't have any audio component to them. And other situations where, say at an airport, they want to kind of do surveillance on some suspects. They can be far enough away that they wouldn't be able to hear them. But with Sue available, she would be able to tell what the people were saying based on the lip reading. And that's how she became a professional lip reader, the first professional lip reader for the FBI. I met Sue and we talked for 2 hours, and I think it was about 2 hours. And she's a lovely woman. Now is an inspiration. She doesn't work for the FBI anymore. She's an inspirational speaker. But while we were talking, she has no hearing whatsoever, no residual hearing whatsoever. While we were talking, she was able to understand what I said pretty much the entire time. I think there was one point where she asked me to repeat myself, and she said, "You're a really friendly guy, Rosenblum, but it would be easier for me if you didn't smile all the time." I said, "Oh, okay. I guess that makes it a tiny bit harder." That's when she asked me to repeat myself, but it was amazing how good she was. It really was amazing, and her speech was very clear. I talked a little bit about Rick Joy before, and not having either auditory or visual feedback from his own speech articulation, and how that made him difficult for me to understand his speech very often. He understood mine better than I understood him. That's the guy that touched my face, right? But for Sue, I understood her speech very, very well. It was almost perfectly clear. And it was probably because, what you'll learn about in just a second, when she was young, she would watch her face articulate in the mirror for hours and hours and hours with her mother's help. And not only did it help her be able to articulate clearly so hearing people could understand her, it allowed her to see her face move, which probably made her a great lip reader. Okay, she lost her hearing at about 18 months. She had language a little bit at that point, but most of, when you're 18 months, you don't have a lot of language, but she understood that, sounds stand for things and that sort of thing, probably at 18 months, but there wasn't much, an 18-month-old can say. But she basically attributes her excellent lip reading skills to the fact that so yeah, it was before most language acquisition, her hearing loss. But she attributes her lip reading skills to the intensive speech therapy that she had, which was a little different from how a lot of other folks have speech therapy. And what speech therapy is for a deaf person very often is just trying to make their own articulation clear. Since they can't hear themselves, they don't have that feedback that most of us do have to know if we're speaking in a clear way. So what a person who's deaf has to do very often is get feedback from a teacher, or in Sue's case, spend a lot of time looking carefully into a mirror to make sure she's articulating clearly. And that's exactly what she did. So her main goal for spending so much time looking at her own face, and I think her mother was there too with her, her hearing mother was there too, was to make her speech clearer so her friends could understand her and that sort of thing. But as a byproduct of that, it allowed her to become an outstanding lip reader. I personally have never met a lip reader, a deaf lip reader, who is as good as Sue. As we'll talk about, we all do lip reading to some degree, but Sue's skills are just amazing. And so if you have questions about Sue, go ahead and type them, and we'll address them when we take our next break. But really, really interesting woman. You should take a look at the book and maybe take a look at her website if you're interested in her experience and what her lip reading has allowed her to do. I should say also, she's of a generation, she's older than me, where cochlear implants are typically hard for an older person to use if they get the implants later, and there's interesting reasons for that. But she decided, I asked her, have you ever considered cochlear implants so you could start hearing a little speech? And she said, no. She has friends that have done it, friends her age that have done it, and they haven't liked the sound of it. Was very harsh, and they didn't perceive much speech anyway. So she's just relied on her lip reading largely to interact with people who didn't know sign language. So what about deaf people? Are they better at lip reading? Yeah, they are. Unsurprisingly, they're twice as good at hearing people at lip reading. Can they survive solely on lip reading? It's difficult. I was talking to somebody, a friend of mine who he's not deaf himself, but he does a lot of research with the deaf, and he said that when deaf people are asked to do lip reading, if they don't have a cochlear implant, or they don't have access to sign language, the person doesn't know sign, if they have to do a lot of lip reading of a teacher or something like that, they will typically say they can do it, they can understand what's being said, but it's still exhausting. It takes a lot of concentration. But that their ability is twice as good at ours. You can imagine if you were watching CNN or something and turn down the sound and try to lip read Anderson Cooper or Don Lemon or something like that, you might get a little bit of what was being said, just maybe by the context or something, but it would be very difficult for you. A deaf person would be better at it. They wouldn't be as good as, most people wouldn't be good as Sue Thomas, but they would be better at it. There are things that play a role in how well somebody lip reads that's deaf. Like if they do get an early start, if they start lip reading at a very young age, and it becomes their primary means of communication. For a lot of deaf people, if they are born into a deaf family, their primary means of communication will be sign language. And even if they're not born into a deaf family, their parents will very often learn sign language immediately. All this, of course, we're talking about without cochlear implants, which is now becoming the more, for children, the more typical way of dealing with deafness. And there's some, cultural issues and political issues involved with that, but I won't go into that now. But if a deaf individual is young, and learns to start lip reading or has the experience of lip reading, and it uses as their primary means of communication, then absolutely they will become a good lip reader. Now, I should mention, I talked to Sue about something, and if you go online, if you're interested in this sort of topic, you go online and say, how do I learn to lip read? There are online programs that propose that they can teach you to lip read. And I told Sue this, and she thought that, first of all, she had not heard of this. And she said, that's like the silliest thing I've ever heard. That's not how, being taught to lip read doesn't make a lot of sense for her. It kind of comes out of a byproduct of either trying to improve your own articulation, as she does, and she's able to keep it up by just interacting with people. So she thinks you can't learn to lip read. And I think it's a good point. Learning to lip read is not like learning to, read text when you're a kid, learning to read, your Go Dad Go books when you're young. It's not like learning the code of written language. It is more like a skill of learning to become a better perceiver, learning to, understand somebody who has a foreign accent or something like that. It's a skill where you refine your perceptual skills, and there's no kind of code that needs to be learned. And that's why she thinks, and I think a lot of people who do research in this area think that we are suspicious that these formal lip reading sort of programs actually work for people. Okay. What else, though? Other factors that play a role. Intelligence, and Sue's a very intelligent person. And gender, right? It turns out that most women who are deaf and use lip reading as their primary means of communication are better than men for whatever reason. Sue qualifies as that. Short STM span, it just means short-term memory span, and I don't need to go into that. You're not going to have to be responsible for the details, but it just has to do with how many items you can remember at any one time. And researchers find that short-term memory span is a way of predicting how well somebody will lip read, and then also regular reading speed. So it probably does relate to intelligence and attentional skills and all that sort of thing. But the idea that you're learning a code is not the right way to think about this, I think. We're going to come back and talk about more of this in just a second, but I also wanted to bring in the idea of neuroplasticity here. So we talked about the plasticity having to do with blindness. Now let's talk a little bit about it with regard to deafness, and specifically individuals who go deaf early. What happens with their auditory cortex? How is it used? Are there compensations for going deaf? And I'll get back to lip reading in just a second, but I thought this would be a good place to talk about this at least a little bit. And there is some evidence that, yeah, for individuals who now have an auditory cortex that isn't getting input from sound, they will reassign it to vision to some degree. And in fact, what you find is that somebody who is deaf and doesn't have a cochlear implant will be better with certain visual skills. They'll be faster at reacting to what we'll call visual motion. If they have to determine something's moving or not moving in the visual field, they'll react faster. And I think even more interestingly is that visual motion skill is even better relative to non-deaf people if the motion is in the periphery of their visual field. So as a deaf individual, I would be faster at saying that I can see something moving on my right or left if it's way over to the side of where I'm looking, okay? So I can see something moving, or I can see something, even without motion, they're better at telling you whether something is there or not, which is interesting. Because what it means, I believe, is that they're not able to use their auditory system as what one of its functions is to warn us of things are coming towards us that we can't immediately see. So if we're looking forward, right, and things are coming from behind us or from the side of us, and they're not in our visual field, our auditory system will say, hey, there's something on your right, turn around. If you're deaf, you don't have that ability. So the way the brain kind of compensates for that is say, okay, let's use the auditory brain that's not getting sound to make the visual system better so it can detect things that are on the side. Okay? So in other words, its compensation makes the visual system better so it can act as a little bit of that warning system that a deaf person doesn't have because they can't hear sounds approaching from behind them. Okay? Which is really interesting. I mean, if you were to design a compensation system, that would make a lot of sense, which is pretty cool. Okay, and other things about what the auditory cortex does in a deaf person. Oops, sorry. It responds to sign language. So when a deaf person is using sign and they are looking at sign, in fact, their auditory system, their auditory brain areas, the auditory cortex, gets involved to make them better at sign language. Okay, and it kind of generalizes not just to sign language, but it also generalizes to hand and arm gestures as well, which is interesting. You're going to see it also is going to respond. That auditory cortex will in fact respond to lip-read speech, but that's going to actually be true of all of us, which is really interesting. But the idea that, okay, if a deaf person, obviously a deaf person is not getting auditory input, the auditory brain area is not responding to anything, so that coming through sound, so it gets reassigned, and it's going to get reassigned to detecting things in the visual periphery, but it's also going to get reassigned to something that it can do with language that's not through sound, and that is with sign language. So the auditory cortex becomes involved in deciphering signs that another person is making, which is really interesting. All right, let's continue with this, then we'll take our break, and I'll take some questions. And that is the point that I think, if you've read ahead, you certainly know or I may have said before. And that is, even though we start our discussion with somebody like Sue Thomas and talk about the deaf, what my lab is interested in is how we all use lip-read information and how we automatically integrate that with auditory speech. So yeah, I do have some experiments that I've done on with a deaf population in collaboration with the deaf population, but much of our research in my lab has to do with hearing individuals. Because we know, despite what we might think about our lip reading skills, to some degree we all lip read, and to a great degree, whatever we can lip read, we automatically integrate with what we hear. So maybe you've noticed yourself in noisy environments, for example, watching the face of the person that we're talking to, like at a party, like in a noisy restaurant, something like that. And you might not be aware that the reason you're doing that is actually to understand them better. Yes, it does help you concentrate to look at their eyes, and it's polite to look at their eyes. But even if we feel like we're looking at their eyes as we're talking to them, our visual system can take information from what's under the eyes, and that's the articulating mouth. And so certainly there's lots of research that shows if auditory speech is noisy, if there's a background noise to it, if there's a lot of people talking at once, just seeing the mouth makes our understanding so much better. It's like turning up the volume of the auditory speech a lot. It becomes a lot more clearer. And I talk a lot about a little demonstration you can do at home with your TV set and that sort of thing. And it works out very well. We also use visual speech, all of us, when we are listening to a heavy foreign accent. So we talked about when we talk to people with accents, we imitate them and all that sort of thing. But we do something else. If somebody has a heavy accent and you can't really understand very easily what they're saying, if you look at their face, it does help. And research does a careful job making sure that it is seeing the lips move. That does help with that. And yes, that's absolutely true. And even if it's clear speech, there's no background sound, and the person that you're talking with doesn't have a heavy foreign accent, if what they're saying is complicated, is a little intricate, if they're talking about the brain or something technical, if you're looking at the mouth move, it helps us understand what's being said. Okay, so we are essentially lip reading in all these situations. And we're not, again, lip reading without sound. We're using lip read information with sound, and it substantially helps us understand what's being said when it's added to sound. So yes, we all do that all the time. Other kind of cool examples: language acquisition, whether we're learning our first language when we're babies, or our second language when we're, so for some of you, I think you probably learned 2 languages when you were young, but for me, I didn't learn my second language, which was Spanish, when I was, I don't know, I guess maybe in junior high school. Oh yeah, I remember I learned Spanish and Hebrew at the same time. Don't ask me to say anything in either of those languages. But when I was learning those languages, it shows that it helps if I'm looking at the person who is speaking that new language. And the same thing is absolutely true with infants. And that's maybe the more understood example of that. With infants, this is maybe most I guess, conspicuous with blind infants. So these are now infants who are blind but have no problems hearing. Okay, so ultimately they're going to be great listeners to speech and that sort of thing. But when they're young, when they're blind, they are good at hearing overall, but they have trouble making certain distinctions in their language. For example, a blind child who's, again, hearing fine, will take longer to be able to both hear and produce the sounds M and N. So blind children are a little delayed in language, but in a very specific way. They're great in most ways, but certain sounds they have trouble distinguishing. M and N. Now, if I were to show you this sound, kind of chart, the sound graph of M and N, you should see that they were very, very close to each other, those sounds. Acoustically, they're very similar. Visually, though, they're very different, M and N. And when we're learning to hear the difference between M and N, we use the visual information, say, on our parents' faces to help us kind of hear those distinctions better, those very subtle distinctions better. So eventually we don't need to look at the face. It's still sometimes hard to hear the difference between M and N on a phone call. They're still very close in their acoustics. But we are able to make that distinction just through sound alone after being kind of trained with both hearing and seeing our parents make those articulations. A blind child, on the other hand, doesn't have the ability to use that facial information, that lip-read information to make that distinction, and therefore have a harder time with it. Okay, so it takes them longer. They do get it eventually, but it takes them longer to make that distinction, which is really interesting. It really shows how important being able to see a face is as we're learning our language. Otherwise, we're delayed a little bit in these very kind of predictable sorts of distinctions. And then we all lip read. When we do it lip read, and again, our lip reading skill isn't like Sue Thomas's, but we do all lip read to some degree. And when we do, it seems to occur automatically. And an example of this is something I've referred to before called the McGurk effect. And I've got two examples of this. Let's see, I know the videos aren't going to work great. Let me show you the top video first. And what you're going to see is this face articulating different syllables, and it's going to be very simple syllables. It'll be, I think, 4 different syllables. And then I'm going to stop the recording and ask you what you heard. So just watch the face and listen to what these different syllables are. Hopefully, it will work okay across the Zoom connection.
Ba. Ba.
Yeah, I bet it doesn't work. That's okay.
Ba. Ba.
You know, I imagine it's not working well, but most people, when they say that, they hear ba, va, da, and tha. Let me show it one more time, and let's see if you get what I get. Right here, it looks great. I'm getting ba, va, da, da. Oops. Here it comes again.
Ba. 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 Ba.
Well, I don't know if it's working. You'll tell me when we take our little break. But what I'd like you to do now, to the degree that maybe it worked a little bit, I want you to now just listen and not look. So maybe look away or close your eyes. I'm going to play the exact same thing again, and the sound should be fine. But let's see if, now that you're not looking, if it sounds any different. Sorry about this.
Ba. 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 Ba.
Okay, so I won't stop the slides here. Yeah, I will. I will stop the slides here. I'm very interested to see if it works. But this is called the McGurk effect, if it does in fact work. You know, what I have down here, I'm sorry I can't show. This is a kind of, I think it's about a 5-minute film from the BBC, from one of their science shows, and they actually interviewed me on the Santa Monica Pier about this, and then they use my face to demonstrate the McGurk effect. And what I'll do is I'll just post this. I don't think it's worth showing the whole thing because of the quality of video through Zoom, but I will post this on the our video site, our YouTube site. That I think it's one of these videos that people say to me that they find it's one of the best examples of this, and I think it's gotten something like 4 million views or something ridiculous like that. So you might have already seen it already. But let me take a little break here, and basically, before I say that, so I should say what was in the video that you just saw. Actually, what most people say when they perceive the video in real time with the face together with the sound is they will report ba, va, da, tha. I believe that's the order. And then when I ask them to look away, they'll learn that there was a trick. Rabini was here and did a trick on us because the audio channel is just the syllable ba, ba, ba over and over again. And so what it shows is what your eyes see affects what your ears hear. The visual articulation you see helps determine what you believe you're hearing the person say. In many cases, the visual, the lip-read mouth can override what's being heard. So very common if you see somebody articulating a va, but your ears are actually getting a ba, you'll say, oh no, I'm hearing a va. Other times, if you're seeing a ga, seeing somebody articulating ga, but hearing again a ba, people will say, oh, I'm hearing a very clear da, which is kind of a compromise between the two. And that's what the McGurk effect is about. Your lip reading overrides and integrates with what you're hearing, so it affects what you believe you've heard. Okay, let's see if that works for folks, and then we'll take some questions and that sort of stuff. Okay. All right. So, yes. Alexandra, do you know the show? So there's a show called FBI about Sue Thomas. That's absolutely right. Talk about it in the book. My ASL teacher in high school played her in the show? Really? That is so interesting, Alexandra. So she's the actress, yeah, and I don't know if do you know if she's still acting? Yeah, very cool. Yeah, very interesting. So your teacher was the person who played her. It was the person that you saw next to Sue in the show with the dog. I guess the dog played a big role too. So yes, you can see that show. I believe it's available on somewhere on YouTube. You can look up the episodes, and I guess it's interesting. Oh, very cool, Alexander. Her name is Deanne Bray. She's a famous deaf actress. She still acts, but she's primarily teaches. Oh, that's so cool. So she's somewhere in Southern California. Is that right? That's very cool. Huh, that's a great, thank you for sharing that with me. That's really interesting. Okay, so, and then Araceli says that you could hear, okay, how many people got the McGurk effect? At least to some degree you realized that what you saw affected what you heard. Just say yes or no, whether you got that. Anybody? Yes, so the effect work? Yes, 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 good, good, okay. It worked pretty well, good, good. I really like people to experience it because I think it helps kind of show that it kind of really, I think when people experience it, they really feel like it's affecting their hearing. It's not like something that, oh, it could go one way or the other, but they feel like they hear what they're seeing, and that's a really interesting aspect of it. Excellent. Any other questions, or should we go ahead to a poll very quickly and look at that? Okay, let's do a poll. And want another imitator? Let's see. Yes. Okay, this is going to be another imitation one. And so this has to do with the situation I discussed where people are imitating speech, ba and pa. So the feature of speech helping us to distinguish ba from pa, which we unconsciously imitate, is called what? Proxy touch, the Tadoma technique, voice onset time, or none of the above. So this is a little trickier. Okay, it's no all of the above, it's none of the above. But remember we talked about the distinction between ba and pa, and we talked about the fact that that can be imitated at a very, very fine grain level. What was that feature called? Okay, proxy touch, Tadoma technique, voice onset time, none of the above. Let's see how we do. All right, this looks like it might have been a little bit harder for people. That's okay, that's no problem. Hey, you can look back on your slides if you want. I don't mind if you're using an open book, as long as you understand. I want you to learn from the question, that's the important thing. Okay, let's just give them another few seconds. About half of you have responded. That's okay, you don't all have to respond. It's really a learning tool more than anything else. Of course, you're not being graded, of course. Okay, let me add the poll here. The correct answer is, in fact, the one that you chose most frequently. It is voice onset time. So voice onset time, just to remind you, is the time between when your lips part from each other and when they open up, when your lips open up, and when your vocal cords start vibrating. So the onset of the voice relative to when the lips open up. And that's the thing that distinguishes ba from pa, right? Just very quickly. For pa, our lips open and then our vocal cords start vibrating. For ba, our vocal cords start vibrating just before our lips part. But then we talked about the fact that for pa, right, the time difference between when we open our lips and our vocal cords start vibrating can be distinct for different people. Remember Posh Spice, who I realize you might not know who that is. She's married to the famous soccer player, and she was in an old group called the Spice Girls. And if you don't know anything about them, don't bother. Anyway, I'm sorry if you're a fan. But anyway, the way she might talk, she would have a longer voice onset time. My name is Posh Spice. And I would say, nice to meet you, Posh. And I would have a shorter voice onset time. And that is what is imitated. So the correct answer is C. A proxy touch has to do with tools. Remember that? Painting or mixing soup. The Tadoma technique has to do, and I can understand why people might get a little confused by this, because that has to do with speech. That's what Helen Keller did when she was touching a face. Okay, but that's not the feature that's being imitated. That's something different. And none of the above is incorrect because C is correct. Okay, so oh, I didn't share the results. Okay, I'm sorry. There you go. The correct answer is C. Voice onset time. 57% of you got that right. Okay, any questions on that? Then let's go ahead and continue with our lecture. Cool. We are talking about the McGurk effect. Now I guess many of you have experienced at least, and that's a good thing, because I wanted you to have a sense that it really does seem to, I don't want you to watch this silly video right now. You can watch it on your leisure. There's nothing new in that video that isn't already discussed, that I didn't already discuss using this demonstration on top, except you get to see a close-up of my mouth. Okay, anyway, let's go to this. The neat thing about this, when you felt like you were hearing these syllables, it was an interesting phenomenon, because if you look at what's going on in the brain during the McGurk effect, or when you're just lip reading without any sound at all, your, oops, what's going on here? Your brain acts as if it's hearing sound. So lip reading activates auditory brain areas as if the auditory brain is hearing sound. In fact, if it's a McGurk effect situation where there's audio and visual information, your auditory brain is activated as if it's hearing the syllable you're seeing, which now probably for most of you makes some sense. It's consistent with the fact that you felt like you were hearing what this person was saying. It wasn't an issue of, you felt like you were seeing one thing and hearing something else. You felt like your ears were getting the syllables that were actually being given to you visually. And that's why it's such a kind of a famous effect. It's one of the most studied effects in the perception literature, because it's so powerful. It's really interesting. We have an experience of sound even though it's been given to us by sight. And that makes sense now, that the auditory brain is acting as if it's hearing a sound. Certainly when you lip read on its own, you're not hearing sound, but your auditory brain at some level is processing it as sound, which is really interesting. Okay, so we're making the argument that speech perception has evolved to be a multisensory function. When people talk about speech, they think about speech as something you hear. But the idea that we're able to use telephones or cell phones or whatever, yes, you can understand speech that way. But when speech evolved, it was something that evolved in one-to-one interaction, right? Our old ancestors in the caves, they interacted in front of each other when they were communicating with speech. And so speech is in fact something that probably evolved to be heard and seen, and then slowly became something that we could hear on our own. So you didn't have to see somebody, but still, we have the parts of our brain that use all types of information for speech, including that which we get from touch. So this McGurk effect, you may not, there's a nice illustration of the McGurk effect. So yeah, good. Here's a good one. Our ears are getting ba in this case. our eyes are getting ga, and we perceive it in this specific combination as something in between ba and ga. There's other examples where there's overriding of the visual information with the auditory information, and we end up hearing something that we're basically is just coming through to us visually. But in this case, there's kind of a fusion information. This works with all language backgrounds. It doesn't matter whether your your native language is Chinese or Spanish or Hindi or something like that. Some form of the McGurk effect is going to work for your perception. Okay, it might not be this particular. It depends on the segments. The sounds you have in your language. It might not work like this for Hindi or something, right? It has to be another combination of sounds, but some form of the McGurk effect will work regardless of your language background. It works with pre-linguistic infants, and I'm not going to talk about the details of this. You can look in the book. This is an old experiment that we conducted in 1997, where we were able to show infants that hadn't yet started to speak. I think they're 4 or 5 month olds, do show something like a McGurk effect. And the book talks about the different ways you can test infants in doing that. But I wanted to say, it seems like it's something as early as it can be tested with infants. The infants do show this same sort of integration of the audio and visual information. It turns out, as the research on lip reading and visual speech has gone on, that the things that you can actually see on a face are really much more varied than we ever thought. So, if you look at a face, like you looked at that McGurk face just a second ago, you saw that person producing ba, va, da, and you say, oh yeah, I can lip read the distinction there. I can see those differences. There's certain things I can lip read, certainly. That's really simple. I still can't lip read Anderson Cooper or whatever. But as it turns out, people who don't even have very much lip reading experience, like you and me, can lip read a lot more. So we can tell by looking at somebody articulating silently whether they are asking a question or whether they're saying a statement. So that's what's meant here by intonation. Intonation is kind of the melody of a sentence. So if I'm asking a question at the end of my sentence, it goes up like this, versus if I'm just making a statement where at the end of my sentence it goes down like this. Okay? That's an intonation difference. And believe it or not, you can lip read that. You can look at a face and at better than chance levels determine whether that person, even though you're not getting sound, asked a question or just made a statement. And there's things that we can look at that help us with this. So if you look at my face doing that, maybe you can see things on my face that indicate a question. Right? My eyebrows go up, that sort of thing. But I'm trying to exaggerate that. Even with much more kind of controlled faces that aren't emoting very much, subjects can at better than chance levels determine whether somebody's just asked a question or not, even if they can't get most of the words, right? You might know that certain languages have tonal distinctions. So I believe in Mandarin, there is a distinction. I can't remember the Mandarin word, but the same kind of word components are used for horse and mother. And what distinguishes them is whether the tone of certain syllables go up or down. That's tonal language distinctions, right? Mandarin is one of them. And it is a distinction you'd want to be able to do. You wouldn't want to call your mother a horse, obviously. And so that is also something, believe it or not, that can be lip read by people who know Mandarin. So no sound available. They're just watching people say single words, and they're able to tell it better than chance levels whether that word is the word for a horse or a mother. Okay, ma, is it? I can't remember what that is, but other things. What we call pressure or subglottal pressure, the amount of pressure that is kind of built up, like, here's a good example, pa and ba, pa and ba. There's more pressure built up for ba because of the amount of that we're holding our lips together for a little while longer for ba than we are for pa. And that is something that can be lip read. And then accent. So if you watch a video of somebody speaking a sentence with a foreign accent, you can lip read that. And these things seem kind of, wow, that's kind of interesting, trivial information. But what the story of this is that it doesn't make a difference I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The story of this is that we have so much information available to us that you would not think we would be able to use on a face. It's not just a distinction between ba and va and da and tha. Okay, there is information on a face for all of these different dimensions. It is probably information that someone like Sue Thomas or someone like other people that could lip read very well would be able to pull out. But even if we can't do it at at great levels, we're able to do it with very little experience at better than chance levels, which is interesting. There's a lot more information on a face for language than we ever used to think. Okay. At the same time, there's some really interesting findings about how aware we must be of a face. And this is the one, there's lots of examples of this now, which are really interesting. But here's an example that we have from 1996, I believe, before you were born, where what we did is we used this, before I talked about this point light technique where we put points of kind of light on major joints of the body and have people walk around. Remember you saw that when we were discussing learning to perceive better through imitative skill. Here's an example. We put little points on a face and we intentionally wanted to make this face be disguised. We didn't tell anybody when they came into the experiment that it was a face. In fact, we asked them what they thought they saw. And as they looked at this image, as you're looking at it right now, what does it look like to you? I'd say maybe someone said a butterfly. Someone said, oh, it just looks like a constellation of stars. It looks like splattered milk. I have no idea. A lot of people said I have no idea what it is. Some people thought it was a projective test, like the kind of Rorschach test that we give in psychology. It's something you have to, when you do psychology research and you show weird stimuli, very often you have to say there's nothing projected. This is not like a Freudian test or anything like this. This is much more boring. So they are asked again and again, what is this? No idea. And then what we did is we showed it to them moving, and I'm actually going to show it to you moving right now with no sound. Okay. Now, you and I know what we're looking at, but if you just came into an experiment naive and didn't know that this had to do with speech, you might not know. And in fact, a lot of our subjects didn't. About half of our subjects at that point said, I have no idea, and maybe some said, I don't know, is it a butterfly that's now flapping its wings? It's a constellation that's kind of regenerating itself. Really kind of creative answers that we found really kind of entertaining. Some people did say, oh, I think I'm looking at a face, and the face is doing something. It's saying something. But still, most people didn't. And then what we did, watch this is fun, is we started showing the face, and we didn't ask them again what it was, but instead asked them to tell us what syllables they heard.
Ba. Ba.
This works great.
Ba.
Okay.
Ba. Ba. Ba.
This is okay. So here's the deal. I'm looking at this here, and it's working really well on me. It might not work for you. Okay, so what we did here is this face is actually articulating va, va, va. But the auditory component is actually ba, ba, ba. So it's a McGurk effect, right? It's a McGurk effect sort of stimulus. There's a mismatch between the audio syllable and the visual syllable. The question is whether or not just this very reduced face would still induce the same sort of effect. And what we found was about half the people who saw this, or I should say this, most of the people about half the time ended up perceiving or thinking they were hearing what they were actually seeing. So again, their ears are getting ba, their eyes are getting va, and about half the time everybody says, oh, I'm hearing va. So the McGurk effect works. It doesn't work as well as if you're seeing a full face, a fully illuminated face, but it does work. And then at the end, we asked them this. We said, okay, now do you know what this image is of? And about 2/3 of the people at that point said, it's a face. I got it. And the face is articulating. And that's why there's, I'm hearing syllables at the same time, right? But still, there was 1/3 of people that said, I don't know, I'm hearing syllables, but I'm seeing, I don't know, a star, a constellation of stars. I'm seeing splattered milk, a butterfly flapping. I don't know what that is. The question is whether they showed the McGurk effect, whether the people that never consciously recognize this image as a face, did they show a McGurk effect? And the answer is yes, to the same degree as those that knew it was a face. The idea is this, that our brain is looking for lip-read information to the degree that it doesn't even need to consciously know it's seeing a face. That's how much it wants this information, right? It wants information about articulation, even if it's not conscious of seeing a face, which is really, really cool. There's been many more elegant demonstrations of this since we did it in 1997, but that's the one I like to show because it's our stimuli. It also works with Tadoma, and it is in fact something I said before. Remember Tadoma? Tadoma is what Rick Joy uses, is what Helen Keller uses to perceive speech. But I also mentioned when we were talking about Tadoma that if you bring that naive people like you and me can come in and we can distinguish bas and vas and das, even though we've never been asked to do that before. And it integrates with heard speech in that it makes distorted, noisy heard speech easier to perceive for us that have never done it before. It actually helps us lip read better. If we're touching a face and lip reading at the same time, we actually are able to get more information because we're feeling the vibrations here and all that sort of stuff. But it also induces a McGurk effect. Now, I'll go through this quickly. We've already gone through it once. But the idea here is that you're wearing headphones, your eyes are shut, you're touching a face. The face might be saying va silently, va, va, va. And through the headphones, you're hearing a synchronized ba. What you feel overrides what you're hearing, so you think you're hearing the articulating face you're touching. The same thing works. Again, there's one more example of this, but before I get there, let me just do a little summary. Even though we've never touched faces before, when we do touch a face, it automatically integrates with what we're hearing, okay? Finally, what we'll call a kinesthetic, and I wish I hadn't used this term. Kinesthetic just means that what we're doing is we're feeling our own bodies move, okay? That's all kinesthetic means. Kinesthetic is the information we get about our body's own movement. And what has been shown is that if you are listening to ba and ba over and over again through headphones, if you are silently articulating va, 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 our own movements can affect how we hear the speech, okay? Our own movements can affect how we hear the speech. And again, most of us have never done that type of thing before, right? But the brain is looking for articulation, information for what a person is articulating, what a person is doing with their mouth. And it doesn't care whether it gets that information through hearing a face articulate, seeing a face articulate, touching a face articulate, or feeling our own faces articulate. And in many of these cases, we haven't had experience doing these sorts of things before. So having experience touching a face and hearing a face together isn't necessary for us to spontaneously integrate that information. The brain is after what the speech articulation is of the person speaking. It wants to know what the mouth is doing of the person speaking. It wants to know what the tongue is doing, what the jaw is doing, what the voice box, what the vocal cords are doing. And will take in that information any way it can. It is not concerned about which sense it's getting that information from. And that's why this is one of the most studied phenomena, these McGurk effects and multisensory speech, because it's kind of giving a new view of the brain, that the brain is really interested in what's going on there and doesn't really care whether it's getting that information from seeing or hearing or touching or experiencing our own motion through this kind of kinesthetic information. The brain just wants to know what is out there and is kind of in some ways ignoring which sensory modality it's using to get there. And that's a really interesting and kind of profound aspect of this kind of multisensory research, which is why it's been such a popular topic over the last, I say 15 years, okay? All right, I am going to now change things. I think we can keep going. We all right? We okay? Good. Let's go into something else. Another aspect of speech perception and faces that I think you'll find really interesting. And it has to do with how faces match voices, knowing how faces match voices. And this is the sort of thing that you may have experienced before, where you listen to somebody on a podcast. Maybe podcasts are the best example of this now. You listen to somebody's voice on a podcast, for months, and then finally you see their face and you think, that's not what I thought they would look like, right? That's not what I thought they would look like. And in fact, one of the kind of classic examples of this is Mike Tyson, right? He kind of has this kind of high voice that's kind of like this. Don't tell him I did an impression of him. Please don't tell him. But it's kind of like this, and then you see him, and he's, this huge guy, that kind of isn't, intimidating looking. I guess he's a pretty nice guy, as it turns out, but he's, he's pretty, imposing looking, and he's one of these cases where it seems like his voice doesn't match his face. However, I think those in some cases are exceptions that prove the rule, and you're going to see examples that we are very sensitive to how faces match voices, and that is something that needs to be considered in detail. And, I'm going to go through this quickly. Read the book if you're interested. This is actually, you're not going to be tested very much on, if at all, on this, so I'm going to go through this quickly. I interviewed a producer of the animated movie Bolt. You guys know Bolt? It's actually a really fun movie if you haven't seen it. It's about the dog that's an actor, and he plays a dog in the TV show that supposedly he's in, where he has superpowers, and this little dog actually in the film believes he truly has these superpowers, and kind of learns that he has other powers that aren't the type that the super dog does. It's a cute thing. But what I talked to Chris Williams about was how he tried to find the voices that would best fit the characters in the movie. And he ends up using John Travolta down here. That's John Travolta, if you're not familiar with him. He's been in a lot of movies. And they spent so much time choosing the right actor for the character. So the character's drawn first. I mean, they knew what Bolt was going to look like long before they chose which voice they were going to use. But what they do basically is they think about different actors that might be a good voice for this character, and they listen to 10 to 20. He said they had over 20 actors they were considering, and what they do is they take audio clips from different movies, say of John Travolta's movies, and have lines that are just of his different movies, and they play his voice as they're looking at the character that they've drawn to be in this movie they're going to make. To see how well it fit. And it takes a long, long time to listen to these kind of what we'll call just loops of audio clips of John Travolta's voice. He said that for the main character, it can take months to try to make a decision on who they want. And of course, then they have to be able to find him. By the way, actors really like doing these movies if they can do it. It's a very easy acting job. They can come in on their own time to the studio. Sometimes the recording equipment actually goes to the actors' homes. They don't have to get dressed up. They don't have to spend any time in makeup. They do it on their own. They don't have to go by anybody else's schedule. So these days, if it's good money and it's offered to an actor, they very often will take an animation job. And so they did ask John Travolta, and he said yes. But it took a long time. Other actors in this movie, voice actors, there's Susie Essman. I'm not sure she is. She's an actress that's in that Larry David show, Curb Your Enthusiasm. She plays another character in the movie. It takes a long time to find them. And then what he said is that if it's done well, the characters can sometimes appear like the voice actor. So what people would do is they come up to Chris Williams and said, I really like the way you animated the Bolt character to look like John Travolta. There's something in his face that looks just like John Travolta. And what Chris will say is, we didn't do that at all. That character, the look of that character was absolutely established before we even chose John Travolta. There's something about the way John Travolta speaks that kind of changes the look of the character, so the impression is that the character actually looks like the actor, okay? Which is kind of an interesting sort of phenomenon on its own. So it's kind of we can say that's kind of a kind of subtle cross-modal influence. Okay, this is one more thing I want to say about my interview with him, and one of the things I found most interesting was this. As I said, actors like doing this because they can do it on their own time. They can come into the studio whenever they want. They don't need the other actors there. So, there's many, many scenes where John Travolta's character, Bolt, is talking to Susie Essman's character. That's Susie there on the bottom. Susie voices a character that's a cat, that's Bolt's friend. And there's many scenes where they're talking with each other. None of those scenes involved the actors being in the studio at the same time. John Travolta did all of his lines first, and then Susie Essman came in and did all of her lines. And Susie Essman didn't even listen to John Travolta's lines when they were making the movie. She just basically said the lines that were in the script in different ways. Like she said, "Oh, Bolt, you'll never understand how things work." Okay, that's a line in the movie, say. She'll have to say that about 10 different ways that they will then record. Okay, they'll say, "Okay, Susie, that was great. Now let's do one faster. Bolt, you'll never understand how things work." Okay, a little slower and a little bit more sad. Oh, Bolt, you'll never understand how things work." And she'll say it 10 different ways. And the reason they're doing that, of course, they want a good recording, but because they need it 10 different ways, because when they bring it together with John Travolta's lines, okay, they have to sound like they're talking to each other. And the reason for that is because Chris Williams knows that the way you say something will be a partial imitation of how someone else says it. So if when John Travolta said the line, before Susie Essman's line, I'm making these up now, Muffins, I think was her name. Okay, I don't know. The cat's name was Muffins. Muffins, I've got to go home. I've got to find my owner. And then Susie Essman's character says, "Oh, Bolt, you'll never understand how things work." Those lines have to sound like they're going together. And Chris Williams will say, yeah, we're very aware that when people talk to each other, they say things in ways that kind of imitate each other. And this is the speech imitation problem for these animators. And in fact, what he said is that process of sticking people's lines together before the animation can even occur often takes longer than the animation itself. He said it is a very hard thing to make characters sound like they're talking with each other when they were recorded not talking like each other. And what I thought is that is so interesting. It suggests that the producers are aware that the human brain is very sensitive to how other people talk to each other and do subtle imitation. So it goes back to this imitation thing we've been talking about for the last few classes. Observers, audiences know when people aren't imitating each other well enough. Okay, I thought that was really interesting. Let's take a little break here and see if there's any questions and do one more polling question. Any question? You like Bolt? Have you seen Bolt? I usually show a clip of the movie. It's not going to come through, but how many people have seen Bolt? Have you seen Bolt? Well, I think I still have 33 of you. I've seen it. Yes. Good. I'm glad you liked the movie. I can try to link a clip, but almost any clip you'll get of Bolt has two characters talking to each other. And now when you watch that, or when you watch, I don't know, what are some good recent animated movies, fun movies that have come out? A new Pixar thing just came out, right? Onward, yes. Same deal there. And I can't remember who does Onward, who the voice actors are in Onward. Isle of Dogs is really good. Actually, let me get back to Isle of Dogs. Tom Holland does Onward, is that right? Good. And you remember any of the other characters? Chris Pratt. Okay, so those characters were never in the same studio together when they did that. And what that involves then is to make them sound like they were by having their lines sound kind of similar in the way they're said. Now, Isle of Dogs, and this is a great example of a deviation from that rule. Isle of Dogs, and I can't remember the director, but he's done other movies. Another movie with dogs, foxes, or The Fabulous Mr. Fox. Is that right? Is that Wes Anderson? Thank you, Elisa. Perfect. Oh, you guys know a lot about animated movies. Good for you. I think some of these are great movies. Good. I know a lot of you are fans. When Wes Anderson does this for Isle of Dogs and The Fabulous Mr. Fox, I think, He actually brings in the actors together. He says that he thinks it's so important that they actually have their dialogue together. He will schedule, and it's much harder for the actors to kind of coordinate their schedules, and they probably get paid more and all that sort of thing. But he thinks it's so important. He says that, when I watch animated movies, I can often tell when they're not together. And in fact, I'll tell you, if you want to get an example of this, watch a Saturday morning cartoon or something like that. Or maybe one of the less produced Nickelodeon cartoons, you can tell that the actors are working together. And so Wes Anderson is so bothered by that, he actually brings his actors together and have them read the lines in the studio together, which is interesting. You can kind of tell a difference. That's really great. Good. Thank you for sharing all those ideas. One more polling question very quickly. We'll do this one on lip readers. Okay, we just had this information. You should all get this. Good lip readers. Okay, so which of the following is instrumental in making someone a good lip reader? Is it being deaf, using lip reading as a primary means of communication, being female, or all the above? Let's go ahead and do this one. Yep, you're doing great. Good. Great. You're doing very well. Go ahead and look back on the slide if you want. Okay. I'm going to stop it here just so we can go through it. Don't worry if you haven't had a chance to answer it yet. That's fine. You'll have more than a minute per question when you do the exam, and I'm not giving you a minute here. So don't worry about it if you haven't had a chance to answer it. I'm going to share the results. The correct answer is D. It is all the above. So being deaf absolutely helps. I said that they're twice as good on average as a hearing person. Using lip reading as primary means communication. So in fact, people who have to use lip reading and aren't using sign language that much for various reasons are going to be better at lip reading. So having a primary means of communication will make one a better lip reading. And I said, yeah, for some reason, and you can conjecture why this might be the case, that women tend to be better lip readers than men for whatever reason. I don't know if, when I wrote the book, I looked a little at that literature, but I haven't followed that literature why women are better lip readers than men. I imagine there is a continuing literature and be something interesting to look at if you're interested in lip reading. So the correct answer is yes, all of the above. Okay, great. Almost done, just 2 more slides. So this will be fun. And we're just going to talk a little bit about my research and other people's related research on these slides. So let's go ahead and do that. Good. Yeah, I think that movie stuff is so interesting. I really do. And I so enjoy talking to and in fact, if you've gone through the book in detail, that I talked to a lot of people in the movie business, and I think there's a lot to learn about perceptual psychology from people who do special effects in movies, both sound special effects and visual special effects and animation. I think there's a lot to be done. I think if I were to kind of update the book in some way, or do a follow-up book, I would spend a lot of it on the movie industry. I think there's a lot of lessons from the movie industry for how the brain works. So anyway, okay, let's just finish up our discussion. Oh, there he is right there. There's Mike Tyson, and he does not look happy that I just imitated his voice. I'm sorry about that, Mike. I imagine Mike knows he has kind of a distinct voice. But we do know something about how faces match voices. And in fact, if we're put in an experiment where we're kind of given a choice of 2 faces that might match a voice, we can do it. Okay, we can do that. Typically in these experiments, what it involves is hearing a voice say a word like cat, and then seeing 2 faces, one of which is going to be the same speaker that you just heard. And those 2 faces might say either the same word, cat, or maybe they'll say even a different word. So you'll hear the voice through headphones, cat, and then you'll see 2 faces say dog. And guess what? We can do it. We can match faces to voices at better than chance levels. Okay, what I mean here by speech material is just what I said about dogs, dogs and cats, that you can do it with different utterances of the same word. So you hear the word cat, and then you see two people say cat, but it was recorded at a different time. That would be a different utterance of the same word, or even the same, different words. I probably shouldn't have said speech material. It sounds a lot more technical than it is. But what I mean by speech material here is you can hear cat and see two people silently articulating dog, and you can make that match. These matches, though, are interesting. They really require people to articulate something, the actors to articulate something. In other words, there's a degree to which you might be able to hear a voice and see then two faces not move, not articulate anything, but you would not be nearly as good as if you saw them articulate something. Okay, and that's very well known now in a number of different contexts. So they don't even need to be necessarily articulating a language you know, but their faces just have to move. Okay, so even if you're listening now to a word from another language, maybe if you don't know Mandarin, you're listening to that word horse, and you hear it through headphones, and then you see two faces articulate a different Mandarin word, and you don't know these words at all. Okay, you've never heard these words before if you don't know Mandarin, if you haven't had a lot of exposure to Mandarin. But you'd still be able to say which face matched the voice, you know, which of these two people made that first word that you heard, even if the words are different, and you don't even know what the words are anyway. So you can still do the same thing. But what seems to be important here is articulation. And let me say, you can do it to some degree. So the question I guess you could ask now is, okay, how are you able to do this? Let's kind of take it away from lip reading for a second. How are you able to do this? Here are two, in some experiments we did, here are two of the women that are faces that were shown to people. And you heard one of their voices first. And the question is now, can you say which of these two people said that word? And in this case here, I'm just showing you individual frames, not actually faces moving. And the question is, would you be able to do that? And yeah, you can do it to some degree, a little bit, probably better than chance levels. And if so, how can you do that? Well, maybe, I don't know, youthful. So that voice sounded more youthful, and this person to me looks younger. I don't know which one looks younger. Maybe she looks younger. I don't know. I'm coming up with ideas. Maybe this person seems taller. That voice seemed a little lower, and this person seems taller, and so therefore I would choose her. And these are all potentially ways you might be able to do it. In fact, attractiveness, you've learned about this, that people with attractive bodies and attractive faces tend to have attractive voices just as they're independently rated. So that could be a way that it's possible. But it also works with faces and with voices, where you basically take out all the information people might be able to use if they're basing it on age and size and attractiveness. How? Okay, what we call isolated speech stimuli. And this is what isolated speech stimuli look like. Sine wave speech. So don't worry about this graph. I know it looks a little technical. Don't worry about it at all. What it is showing, though, is that you can take a speech signal, and take out all the sort of information that might be involved in recognizing a person's age and how tall they are, or how attractive they are, and just leave in parts of the signal that are going to be informative about the way a person articulates. This is how that sounds. Oh my gosh.
Please say what this word is.
Yeah, there it is. Hopefully you're hearing that. Oh, shoot. Sorry about that. I will play it again. Can you tell what this is?
Please say what this word is.
Kind of sounds like R2-D2 or something like that. But knowing that it's speech, you probably were able to hear the sentence, please say what this word is. I have another example of this.
Please say what this word is.
Wait. Oh, shoot. Okay, I do have another example of this. I can't, something about the dog ran around the wall or something like that. But the point is that you can understand what's being said from these sentences, and believe it or not, you can actually identify if they've been taken from your friend's speech. You know, even though these are rendered completely kind of crazy, they sound like R2-D2, in all the age information, in size information, and attractiveness information, you'd have a hard time saying anything about those characteristics. You'd still be able to recognize whether or not that was one of your friends, which is interesting. There's also a way of doing this with visual speech, and it's through what we call this point light technique. And in this point light technique, what happens is we remove all of the information you might typically think is useful for identifying age and size and attractiveness and make a face look like this. You've just seen point light faces with the McGurk effect. This is a little bit of a different point light pattern. We have to do this for an important reason. But these are point light faces that are going to articulate. And now what we can do, and in this demonstration, I don't actually have sine wave speech and point light speech, but I have a heard speech sentence and then 2 point light faces. And your job would be to say whether the first, after you hear the sentence, whether the first point light image or the second point light image is of the same talker. Let's go ahead and do this. So you're going to hear a sentence and then tell me which of the 2 point light talkers this is.
The football game is over.
Now you're going to see the same sentence being articulated. Is that the guy? Or is that the guy? And I should mention just very briefly that those sentences, the audio sentence was recorded at a different time as the point light sentences. And let's try it again.
The football game is over.
Is it this person or that person? In fact, I believe it's the second one in this case. And regardless, people can do this under the right conditions. When the image is big and they're listening through headphones, people can do this at better than chance levels. And they can not only do it with the speech you just heard, but if I had made that speech a sine wave sentence. So in other words, this the matching voices to faces can occur even if you take out the age information, the size information, the attractiveness information, and just leave in the speech information. And what I think is going on here, and I think what other researchers think is going on here, is that we all have an idiosyncratic way of articulating. We articulate based on our dialects. If we grew up in upstate New York like me, I say things a little differently. It's kind of like a Midwestern kind of, oh geez, sort of Minnesota dialect a little bit. And if you grew up down here, you might have much less of a noticeable kind of dialect. But even within our dialects, we all say things a little differently. We all kind of string together our vowels and consonants a little differently, right? And so that is something that can identify us as we speak, and as we speak and make sound, and as we speak and make a face, as we articulate. And so the ability to match, our brain's ability to match speaking faces through sound to speaking faces through sight, lip reading, has to do with the fact that in both cases, the brain's picking up the idiosyncratic articulatory style. I speak, in my specific way, based on my upstate New York dialect, and even within that dialect, the way Rosenblum speaks, it has to do with lots of things, my physiology. But the way I speak is conveyed not just through sound, it's also conveyed through sight, something that you can see in an image when essentially your brain is lip reading it. And that's how we think people can make these matches, through detecting a person's articulatory style that is conveyed both through the sound of speech and the sight of speech. Cool. One more slide, okay? So what we found really interesting, one of the other things we found interesting in our lab is that you can share the experience you learn about a person in one sense with another sense. So auditory and visual speech can share their experience, okay? So let me give you a little background on this. We, maybe unsurprisingly, can hear speech better from talkers that we have some experience with. So you probably would notice this, that if you're on a cell phone and the connection isn't very good, you're better at understanding the speech of somebody who you know well than the speech of somebody you're just now talking to for the first time. So, you know, imagine your best friend calls you and you're in the car and the sound is coming through the, you know, the stereo system. You're using a hands-free system or whatever. You'd probably have an easier time understanding them than if you're, you know, calling some phone bank or trying to make an appointment at the doctor's office and you've just now, this is the first time you're talking to the person. You can imagine doing that better with someone you have familiarity with. And that's not just because of what they're saying, you know, the conversation is what it's going to be like with that person you know better or something like that. It has to do with actually being familiar with the way the person's voice sounds. And that's tested in a number of different experiments where if you actually, within an hour of just learning the sound of somebody's voice, if I were to play a number of sentences from my speech going over and over again, and then later on played sentences of my speech with a background of noise versus somebody else's speech with a background of noise, even if you've just kind of learned my speech for an hour, you would then be better at understanding my speech with that background of noise than somebody else's speech with the background of noise. So that familiarity, that experience can come in a very short amount of time. And certainly for our friends, we have a lot of experience with their voice. And we're talking about kind of the, you know, the superficial aspects of the voice too. Not only is that true about hearing speech, it's also true about lip reading speech. And this again was one of these experiments where we didn't use good lip readers. We had intro psychology students come in and we asked them to lip read from somebody, a single speaker, for about an hour. You know, we had them, they said, oh, I can't lip read. And they said, just try your best. The sentences are very easy. They are sentences like, the football game is over, the flowers were on the table, the ball fell from the window, that sort of thing. Very simple sentences. And people get, I don't know, 1, maybe 2 words right in those sentences, you know, the important words. They might get, I saw the word football, I believe, and I saw something like oven or over. They won't do terribly. But after an hour of that, you know, they'll be okay. They won't be very confident. And then what we'll do is show a whole bunch of different talkers, and they'll be asked to lip read from all those different talkers, and guess who they'll be best with? The person they just had an hour of experience with. So experience helps you become a better listener to a person's speech, and even a better lip reader of a person's speech, even though you're not a great lip reader. Okay, that's pretty cool. But interestingly, that experience that we gain from somebody in one modality, in one sense, can be shared with the other sense. This experience can be shared. So in our experiment, what we did is we asked people to again do this lip reading experiment. They come in here and into the lab and they say, I don't think I'm going to be able to be very good at this. And we say, that's okay. Do your best, try to lip read whatever. They're very easy sentences. You know, we'll tell you how you're doing. Just do the best you can and they'll get maybe 1 word right, maybe 1, 2 words right. But they'll lip read somebody for an hour. And then we'll turn off the monitor of the video and then have them put on headphones and listen to speech in a background of noise. So it's challenging. It's hard. And one of the speakers that we're going to present to them is going to be the same speaker they just lip read from. And the other speaker is going to be a new speaker that they hadn't lip read from. And what we find is after you lip read somebody for about an hour, you are then able to understand their auditory speech better. So the experience you gained in one modality can now be shared in the brain with the other modality to understand what you're hearing better. What you're learning probably there is something about their idiosyncratic way of articulating, and that's really what's going to be important as you're getting better and better with somebody's lip read speech. Okay, or heard speech, you're learning about their idiosyncratic way of stringing together vowels and consonants. So that can be shared when you get their idiosyncratic articulation, okay, their specific way of speaking in the other modality. And it absolutely works the other way too. We've done it both ways. So you listen to somebody's speech in a background of noise for an hour, and then you're asked to lip read that person and some other person. Without, and by the way, no subjects ever know they're lip reading and hearing the same person. We never tell them that. They never guess that. But in fact, it works the other way. So if you've been trained to listen to a particular person, you're better at lip reading them. And what that suggests is, again, what you're learning is something about the idiosyncratic way somebody is saying something. and that can be shared across modalities. The big story here is the brain cares about what somebody is doing as they articulate speech. Okay, the brain cares about what the lips are doing, what the jaw is doing, what the tongue is doing. And will get that information any way it can. And in fact, share that information across the modalities in any way it can. It doesn't really care from which sensory modality it's getting it. Yeah, I guess it prefers to get speech from sound because there's a lot of information there. But if it gets it from sight, if it gets it even from touch, it will use it and say, cool, I'm happy with this. I'm just after articulation. I don't really care very much. And that's one of the big stories about the brain I want you to know. That the brain isn't really divided based on sensory system. It's really divided based on what it's trying to do, its function. If it's trying to understand speech, it's trying to understand how a person is articulating speech, and it doesn't care through which modality it's getting that. And that is very true of a lot of other aspects of how the brain kind of ignores the senses in some way and gets the information any way it can. Okay, that's the last slide. Should I see if there's any questions? Very quickly, any questions? You're welcome, Nicole. Any other questions? Hey, you know what? Let's do it one more poll. How's that sound? Just to give you another question. Let's talk about the McGurk effect. The McGurk effect is consistent with evidence that the brain responds as if it hears lip-read speech, A. B, works with pre-linguistic infants. C, works in all languages. D, all of the above. That's got to be the easiest thing in the world. Go ahead. Yeah. You just learned this, so it's not a problem. Great. I'll just give you 30 seconds for this, just so you have this down. I think you all know this. Everyone's gotten it so far. Yeah. Great. Okay, I'll stop it here. Most of you answered. The answer is, of course, D. You know this. It's going to be one of your questions on the exam. You'll be able to answer that one with no problem. Thank you, people have been. Thank you for saying the nice things. Thank you for being in the course. You've been under the circumstances. You've been wonderful. You've asked some great questions, which I'm really happy about. We've been able to have some really nice discussion. Are there any other questions? Oh, I didn't show the poll results. I'm sorry, Melissa. Oh boy, I sometimes forget to do that. There you go. Okay, good luck with all your finals, everybody. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. There'll be a review session on Monday, and take care. You know, after all this is over, please, if you can, if you see me on campus, I'd love a chance to actually meet you in person, or you can stop by my office or something like that. It'd be really special. Okay, take care, everybody.